We weren't careful. And now, here we are. This is a very different world.
Over the past few years, I've said many things about Jurassic World Evolution 2. I have commented on the various ways I thought the game could be improved, or the various elements I think are not good enough. With the game very much buried and fossilizing, and much like I did with the first game, the time has come around again for a full-scale, multi-part retrospective review. Expect these videos to be in a long format, because I really want to tackle this in as much detail as I can. So where do we start? Let's begin with the end.
Now, what John Hammond and InGen did at Jurassic Park is create genetically engineered theme park monsters, nothing more and nothing less.
I don't think anyone can review Jurassic World Evolution 2 in any in-depth way without first considering the game that came before. After all, many elements of Jurassic World Evolution 2 were entirely based on or driven by the first game, or the responses to that first title. So before we can tackle the second game or its development, let's briefly sum up what I thought about the first game. Having looked back at the 5-part review I did to that game at the end of its development, I find there is still much that I agree with. In many ways, Jurassic World Evolution 1 felt like a beta experience, an initial release of something you would see on early access, starting out as a very bare bones experience. Only instead of having an early access price tag, it was given the full AAA price and sold by a reasonably well-known publisher. Arguably, it required many large-scale updates, patches, and more paid content for the game to end up feeling like a content-rich experience. This is unfortunately something we'll have to come back to as this retrospective review continues. Don't get me wrong, there was very little that I would say was directly offensive or ghastly with Jurassic World Evolution 1. It was, however, death by 1,000 cuts. I found the gameplay was far too simple, it was heralded as a management game, a fact that Frontier focused heavily on in the marketing of the first game, and of course, Frontier are very well known for creating other management titles. In fact, bear with me one moment.
And now for something completely different.
Just before I get really stuck in with this review, I think it's really important we just briefly discuss Frontier as a company. Started in 1994 and based in Cambridge in the UK, it's a fairly small company compared to most game studios. A key element of the company, however, is a focus on games with a management feel. This started with their involvement with Roller Coaster Tycoon 2 and continued with Roller Coaster Tycoon 3, Thrillbill, and Coaster Crazy, Zoo Tycoon, and more. Looking through their list of titles, it is dominated by games with a management or simulation feel. By far their biggest success prior to the Evolution or Planet series was Elite Dangerous, a space-based game where the gameplay is focused around exploration and job management, in a way similar to other games of the dad game genre like Trucker Simulator or Farm Simulator. Elite Dangerous represents a significant success, having sold around 4.8 million copies by 2022. However, it was Planet Coaster that really made Frontier popular. Obviously inspired by the Tycoon games they had already worked on, Planet Coaster became the de facto theme park management game for years after release. And given it was only Frontier's second in-house developed title, was a significant success. Jurassic World Evolution came in 2018, 2 years later. Since then, Frontier has released many other games of the simulator and park management genre in various different well-known franchises. They gained the rights to make Formula 1 management games starting in 2022 and created a Warhammer strategy game in 2023. What I'm trying to point out here is that Frontier is primarily a simulation and management game company. That is their bread and butter. It's what they do. Games like Planet Coaster, Planet Zoo, and Elite Dangerous all demonstrate that they keenly understand the complexity involved in games of this genre, and this is worth keeping in mind as we discuss Evolution, both 1 and 2, because I don't think we can ignore comparing the quality of those titles to Frontier's normal output. Right. Now, where were we? So as I was saying, Evolution 1 was heralded as a park management title, but in playing it I found that description kind of lacking. For a game created by Frontier and created in the late 2010s, it felt seriously lacking in basic management features. There was very little staff or staff management when compared to, say, Planet Coaster. Animal management was extremely simplified. For a franchise focused on the chaotic nature of organic systems, Evolution felt very, well, organized. Guests were merely particle effects with very little impact on your park or how it developed. A far cry from games like Jurassic Park Operation Genesis. It seemed that Frontier's view of what management was in a Jurassic game was very different to their other titles. The game looked acceptable enough, and its graphics were praised at the time. However, it soon grew tiresome looking at those lurid green islands with parks that started to look far too samey given the limited range of buildings and landscapes, dominated by an abundance of green as far as you could see. It wasn't helped by the very limited nature of the environmental tools or the restriction to just 3 ground textures, with the explanation that it was all the map generator could handle. Some might say that none of that really mattered, because the most important part of any dinosaur game is the dinosaurs. True enough, the animals looked good. There really was no comparison between them and other games that had created dinosaurs such as JPOG or Zoo Tycoon 2. But if you started to look past the general appearance, cracks did start to show. The animals were stiff and robotic. They socialized in demon summoning circles, and they were extremely limited in the animations they had. So it didn't take long for you to start seeing the same animation over and over. The options of color and pattern were limited, and in terms of the animals roster, there really were some very big animals missing, with Jurassic World's much beloved Mosasaur one of them. The campaign was good, being fairly extensive, but it was the sandbox mode that really needed a lot of work. To Frontier's credit, a vast number of updates and patches were devoted to that, but it cannot be ignored that the sandbox started with very limited options, and its requirement to unlock things for it in the campaign mode was very tiresome. One thing that I will praise the game for was how it ran. It was supremely optimized, even with large parks not doing much damage to FPS, and the day one experience was mostly bug-free. Over the years I played the game, there were very few bugs that I encountered and very few crashes. While the game felt it had other issues, it at least felt like it had been put together with skill. But by the end of my review for the first Evolution, it could not be ignored that the game was a letdown. I expected something far more impressive given Frontier's reputation with its other titles. What we got was, in my view, a substantial drop in quality from a company that had produced Planet Coaster and Planet Zoo. In comparison to those games, Evolution felt seriously lacking. At the time, I said that compared to those titles, Evolution looked like a village idiot in a family of geniuses. I stand by that assessment. I tried to figure out who was to blame for the way the game turned out, Universal or Frontier, but I really couldn't. It was unclear to me at the time, and still is, who should take the blame. But one thing was certain, Jurassic World Evolution 1 was not good enough. So let's take a trip back to summer 2021, where Jurassic World Evolution 2's journey began.
Don't worry, Ian. I'm not making the same mistakes again.
No, you're making all new ones.
Jeff Goldblum appears on our screens at the Summer Games Fest with news that all of us had been expecting and waiting for. Jurassic World Evolution 2 was in development and coming. And it was coming soon, November of that year. I remember at the time feeling like this was very soon. The hype train between June and November would be considerable. The initial announcement trailer revealed some promising elements that started the hype in a powerful way, and this was put onto YouTube June 10th, 2021. Doesn't that feel like an utter age ago? The whole world was still talking about COVID every day, the UK vaccination program was ongoing, it was a very different time. Over the next few months, we got a glut of information, regular species reveals and dev diary videos on the Frontier YouTube, combined with various live stream gameplay reveals, revealed plenty of the game to get us hyped. June 24th was the first stream Frontier tackled, showing off live gameplay footage. It also revealed the species field guides for the Triceratops and the Amargasaurus, a returning dinosaur and a new one. The stream, however, was more interesting for the details they gave away. There was a focus on developing from the first game in 4 key areas. Number 1, an authentic narrative that pushed narrative with an original story. Number 2, enhanced creativity compared to the first game with new tools. Number 3, deeper management. It's a management game, guest dinosaurs and managing the park are important. Number 4, realistic dinosaurs with more depth in behaviour and interaction. Rich Newbold went on to state that everything in Jurassic World Evolution 2 should be pushing one of those aspects. I'll be coming back to these in later parts of the review, so for now, just keep them in your mind. Amongst the smattering of other details it gave us were details about the new Chaos Theory game mode, more details on dinosaurs having a greater range of interactions with dynamic fighting, and it revealed a few more returning species of animals. But a lot of this information was available in a Game Informer article that released on June 22nd. Now, following this stream came more and more details, much of it new, so what I'm going to do is go through it all in very rough sections very quickly. In terms of species guides, June and July gave us the Amargasaurus, Triceratops, Brachiosaurus and Coelophysis. These were all pretty interesting as it highlighted how the returning species were going to look, which to their credit was better than the first game and some of the new species that were coming. However, July 14th was an important date, at least for me. July 14th is when we got the species field guide for the Stegosaurus, and it was the guide that sparked some concerns, at least for me. My concerns were focused on the quality of 2 animations that the animal used, both clearly copy-pasted from the first game. This made me start questioning just how much of the game was going to be copy and pasted over, especially when it came to the quality of the dinosaur animations. August showed off 2 pterosaurs, so we got to see them for the first time, as well as another new dinosaur in the form of Conclsuions. September came with the next big reveal as we got our first proper look at the Mosasaurus. While we didn't get to see much of its behavior, from what we saw, it definitely got the hype train moving, and we also got to see the T-Rex species guide. October revealed the Velociraptor and showed a pack hunting and attack on a Sinoceratops. Again, new behaviour. We also got the Plesiosaurus field guide, another lagoon animal. November gave us our final guide before the game's release, being the Cryolophosaurus. Something that is interesting going back to look at these species reveals is that we were shown 7 returning animals and 7 new ones. I find it strange that we didn't get to see more of what was brand new to the game. Just an observation. Now, along with species guides, we got 3 dev diaries, short 5-minute videos where the development team got to give us some more details. Dev Diary 1, July 23rd, was a general overview of the game, but went into the 4 game modes that the game was going to focus on. Much was made of the new original Jurassic story the game's campaign would have, as well as the enhanced creativity. Rich Newbold in this diary also made it very clear that the hunting and fighting system was going to be much more dynamic and interesting, and that the animals would interact with their environment in a more authentic way. His words, not mine. Deeper management was also pushed, all things that sounded good on paper. Now, between this dev diary and the next, the pre-order trailer was revealed, as well as what the pre-order was going to include within it. I want to discuss the pre-order stuff in more detail in a minute. This trailer revealed some new details like the amenity modification system and new species. We also got to see an Allosaurus and Conclsuions fighting, all good stuff. Dev Diary 2, uploaded to YouTube on September 22nd, was an interesting one. While Rich Newbold is doing his sucking up to Universal during his opening speech, we see 2 Carnotaurus fighting, using the same animation that was revealed in the pre-order trailer. Again, cause for concern about copy-paste animations again. Much of this dev diary was focused on the campaign mode, as well as showing off the medical veterinary system. But a few quotes really stand out from this. Adam Woods stated that the Chaos Theory modes would all feel unique. At the time, it sounded good, but I remember pondering what they were going to do with Jurassic Park 3. The final dev diary, which came out on October 27, highlighted the basic terrain editing and other features for making our parks. It also discussed the rangers, vets and ACU teams. Something that stands out to me going back and re-watching is how it sounds like the rangers can be sent on patrols and will just handle stuff, something that was not true on the game's release. Something else that stood out from this one was the quote, "many new expressive social interactions." As we know now, this was limited to just one per land animal, and it took 2 years to give us lagoon animals, and it never came to pterosaurs. Looking back at my own videos on all the information we got on the run up to the game's release, there was a lot to get excited about. The overall look of the game seemed a big step up. Many of the new features and additions like the Paleo Vet system and Scientist system seemed on the face of it good additions for expanding the management side of the game, but there was also a lot that made me concerned. The copy-paste animations shown on various animals indicated to me that not everything was going to be as new as perhaps I wanted. Many buildings were also clearly copy and pasted over. A lot of what was great, like the comments about further creativity and management also, while good, were to me rather more like bringing Jurassic World Evolution 1 up to a basic minimum standard for Frontier games. We also had other things like dangerous weather effects clearly not having an effect on the guests. It was clear to me, and remains clear to me now having looked back on all this, that while a lot of the good elements were mentioned, I would not say that I was hyped for the game. I was very much on the fence about whether this was a deserving sequel. Looking back on all this from the present day is also really interesting, as it really demonstrates the difference between the way Frontier handled Jurassic World Evolution 2 and the way they handle their other titles. For example, during the recent hype cycle for Planet Coaster 2, each dev diary was more than 20 minutes long, in comparison to Jurassic World Evolution 2's 5-minute sections. I think it's fair to say that Planet Coaster 2's run-up revealed much more about the game than, say, Jurassic World Evolution 2's.
We can charge anything we want, 2,000 a day, 10,000 a day, and people will pay it.
So I wanted to spend a little bit of time directly talking about the pre-order and deluxe editions of the game, since this is the first place I feel I can critique. But I think it's also a good microcosm for looking at the game and where Frontier got some things wrong. So let's look at the Deluxe Edition first. The Deluxe Edition version of the game came with extra species just like the first game. These were the Pachyrhinosaurus, Attenborosaurus, Huangosaurus, Megalosaurus, and Geosturbergia. All great new additions to the roster for your money. Hold up a minute. Huangosaurus, a base game dinosaur from the first title, had been locked behind the Deluxe Edition paywall. I don't understand why, and to this day, I think it's frankly insulting. One of the best dinosaurs from the first game, sealed in the Deluxe Edition for more money. As the Klingons say,
"And this, we do not forgive or forget."
Included in the Deluxe Edition were vehicle skins based off Fallen Kingdom's DPG logo, which were at least better than that horrible orange skin we got from the first game, and some unique signage for our amenities. Editing Fletcher here, so kind of funny. I didn't even realise that the Deluxe Edition came with unique signs, but apparently it did. It included 6 amenity signs, 3 for the food, sushi, carvery and waffles, 2 drink, fruity and herbal tea, and a souvenir amber. Pre-ordering the game would then give you on top of this new skins for your vehicles, which they called Lost World skins, but basically it was the base vehicles painted with the same dark green as the in-gen Jeeps. But again, it was better than the orange skin that came with the first game. At the time, the base game cost £49.99 in the UK or $59.99 in the USA, and the Deluxe Edition would cost an extra tenner. at £59.99, which is a standard AAA price tag. This price tag is really important for me because I want to point out that Planet Coaster 2 has launched with a price tag of only £39.99 for the base version. In fact, so did Planet Zoo. Planet Zoo's Deluxe Edition was the same price as Jurassic World Evolution 2's base version. In fact, while we're talking about Planet Zoo, let's just for interest's sake look at what you got for that game. The Deluxe Edition came with pre-launch beta access, 3 inclusive animals, a wallpaper pack, and access to the game's original soundtrack. Looking back at this, I don't think any of the puny pre-order bonuses of 3 green vehicle skins can really hold up against 3 species of animal. The Deluxe Edition on the face of it does seem better, but when you think about the fact that one of the 5 animals was being held hostage, and that 2 would launch without social animation of any sort, I think that does bring down the overall quality of the Deluxe Edition. Not to mention the game's increased cost, a AAA price tag. This means that the game has to meet certain standards to warrant that. I want you guys to remember that this game launched at £60, which is, thanks to inflation, now £72. Just food for thought as we go through this review.
After careful consideration, I've decided not to endorse your park. So have I.
So after all the hype videos, all the attempts to get their hands on our money, I had decided to pre-order. Really, I felt forced to, primarily because of just being a small starting YouTube channel, wanting to make the most of a new game to grow the channel. Looking back on that, it might have been the wrong motive for me buying the game. I waited to see what the pre-launch reviews would be like. Now, I remember when it came to Jurassic World Evolution 1 that the game released with some stupidly high scores, and that after my experiences, I felt that the only truthful review had been IGN's. This time around, however, it definitely felt the reviews were a lot less glowing, and many spoke at great length about many of the shortcomings with the game. Overall, the game was considered an improvement over the first, but more than one review pointed out that the game was still very much lacking in the management. As one review put it, the game and its management had clearly been aimed at a very general demographic of people who like dinosaurs, as opposed to people who actually enjoy management titles like City Skylines or Planet Zoo. Day 1 reviews also pointed that yet again, sandbox content was locked behind the campaign and chaos theory and challenge mode progression, a feature that still to this day pisses me off, but I'll get to that in the next bit. Overall, looking back at these Day 1 reviews, I think the best quote was something I found on Third Coast's review, who ended it stating that it does feel like it treads water a bit, and is more than an elaborate DLC than a full game. It is a rather sad thing rereading these Day 1 reviews to see that while they were a lot more willing to criticize on the game, that on the whole, most of the reviews were very positive. The Day 1 experience for all of us would, in my eyes, be a lot worse than the reviews would make out. Just to make it clear, this next chapter will be using the material from the start of Jurassic World Evolution 2's launch to provide a baseline which we will refer back to in later sections.
Welcome to Jurassic Park.
So there we were. Jurassic World Evolution 2 was installed and I was about to go live to stream my reactions to the game as they happened. I had seen some of Evo's early playthroughs, so I was already formulating opinions, but in reality the proof, as they say, is in the eating. Having gone back and rewatched all of that day's streams, some interesting moments stood out. I don't think it's news to anyone who watches my videos that I'm generally quite a critical person. Sometimes perhaps too critical. What amazed me about that Day 1 stream was actually how very positive I was. In comparison to my first review, which would come out a few weeks later, the stream was more or less glowing. So let's look at what impressed me in those first few hours. Visually, the game really did stand out. This was evident just from starting the game up for the first time. Its new, less gamey menu, taking cues from phones and tablets, was sharp and sophisticated. More good was to come. Loading into that first campaign map with the slick, smug voice of Ian Malcolm narrating an opening cutscene again made the game feel much more professional, much more of an event than the first game. And boom, there we were in the desert of Arizona. I think it was very shrewd of Frontier to set the first campaign map somewhere so almost completely alien to those lurid green islands of the first game. Here was a strangely beautiful, almost Martian landscape of orange. As an opening salvo of fire, Jurassic World Evolution 2 seemed to score hits straight away. Of course, this was still very early doors, but again, the praise continued. The game's new UI was far less clunky than the originals, and again felt like a much more professionally made modern product. Then of course there were the dinosaurs. Simple species to start with, but it was clear improvements to the model quality had been made. And again, seeing the initial animals demonstrating their new social animations really was great. Now it felt like these animals were starting to become more like animals than the robots of Jurassic World Evolution 1. Even the action of flying and driving the vehicles felt better, thanks to mechanics that made them feel a bit more weighty and less floaty. Of course, even at this early stage, there were still a few things that earned a few eye rolls from me, primarily the really awful quality of the acting and voice cast. The tete-a-tete between Owen and Claire was just plain awful. Really awful lines that I suppose were meant to be funny just ended up cringy. In fact, here's a few from that first mission.
You could call me a dinosaur wrangler. Though, officially, I'm an animal behaviorist. We may have trouble tracking this dinosaur from the ground, and even more trouble if we're lucky enough to find it.
Then, the sensible thing is to take a capture team helicopter. You can trank it from the air.
See? I like the way I think. We have it. Capture successful.
I knew you'd do it. Never had a doubt.
Really?
Well, maybe one or two.
Well, it's better than usual. I'll take it.
Then we can plan our next move.
We really need that? A plan? I mean, I've always been more of a just make it up as I go kind of guy.
Tell you what, if this doesn't work, we'll try your way.
That sort of sounds like a plan. Sunscreen and drinks by the pool. How's that sound?
Are you seriously asking? Or pretend asking?
Okay, Claire, how about we add some preferred terrain to their pens instead? Better? Claire tells me there are some candidates to recruit. Scientists. Hopefully you could find one as rough and tumble as I am.
Owen, you there? I think you're still muted.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Good idea. What have we got to lose? You know, except maybe a new recruit.
Owen, we have a real problem.
I'm trying, Clara, but it's just, well, this is who I am.
Not you.
It wasn't the only thing I was critical of on this first map. The striking of a full-blown sandstorm towards the end of the operation, which did no harm to guests nor dinosaurs, did not bode well for the other weather effects in the game, and I did find that disappointing. However, overall, I would say that the first map made me feel actually slightly optimistic. In fact, as the day continued and I plunged through yet more of the campaign missions, more and more positives started to reveal themselves. More biomes got to be explored, from the frozen alpine hills of Washington state to the bright forests of Pennsylvania. More variation in biome was really a dramatic improvement. More dinosaurs got to be shown, and boy did they look good, rendered in a much higher fidelity. I also found myself oddly enjoying the DFW building set. Perhaps I had grown tired of the limited range in Jurassic World Evolution 1, but there was something satisfying seeing a whole new range of buildings with a very different look. Various quality of life improvements, such as combining the ACU and Ranger buildings into one response center, also was a genuine improvement, as well as a rebalancing of costs for buildings and the scale of buildings. No more £400,000 ACU center, and no supersized galleries either. Even the hitboxes felt like they played nicer in the second game, with buildings being able to get closer to each other. There was also the general overhaul to how animal care was handled. Now it was a lot fairer to keep an animal happy. Perfection was not necessary, getting close was enough. Attached to the more forgiving animal requirements was the new paleobotany system, something that a lot of us had been happy about when it was finally revealed, and initially I was very positive about the system, but that would only last for about 2 maps. Of course, as the campaign went on, more and more negatives did also start to appear. Washington State was the first time I noticed some very odd behaviour of the dinosaur animations and models. However, this would become something I would notice more and more in future campaign levels. It was clear that the dinosaur animations were still very rough in many regards, with bizarre moonwalking and failed social animations causing them to phase through each other. And in one instance late on in day 1, I got to watch a very strange looking fight between 2 velociraptors where they seemed to be doing the tango more than actually fighting. There was also a persistent bug where the game's frame rate would lock up if I went through 2 main loading screens, requiring a restart of the game. It was, however, the game's new systems that really started to bug me more and more than the few bugs I had found so far. Even on day 1, I was starting to get tired of the repetitive annoyance of sending rangers to scan each new dinosaur to figure out its statistics, sometimes with the rangers having to be sent out multiple times because of a failure to scan the animal the first time. This became quite an annoyance in a later campaign mission where I was looking after a lot more animals. The scientist system also failed to win me over day 1. It was clear right from the start of its inclusion in the campaign that it was there to artificially slow down progress. The more I used the system, the more I grew to hate it. It started to become especially aggravating given its direct connection to almost everything you have to do in the park. Veterinary research and wild dinosaur captures were all based off the system. It felt like added grind, and that really didn't go down well with me. I would say that on day 1, it was when we got to Mission 3, Pennsylvania, where my mood went from positive to more mixed. This was where bugs and glitches with the game became far more apparent. It was where numerous animal animation issues showed up. It was also where we discovered the Ranger and Vet AI was borked to heck. It would be where the boring skins for the poor Ankylosaurus and Diplodocus would reveal themselves. It would be where the paleobotany system revealed its limitations, with excessive amounts of plants needed to keep plant eaters happy to the point that enclosures felt messy. It would be where we gained access to the tech tree, now turned into a grindy fractal tech tree instead of the more freedom-giving one of the first game. It would be where we got to watch a tornado spiral through the park, doing very little to dinosaur guest or building. It would be where we got to watch the dinosaurs waiting for social loops to play, breaking the so-called dynamic system we were told they would have. But even then, still some positives were showing through, like the rocks now being freely rotatable and coming in various shapes and sizes, which would give us a far greater control over enclosure design and decoration. Then there was also the changes to the terrain modification system, so now it wouldn't remove water that was placed down, making it easier to create valleys and rivers. Of course, there was then the very big bad of the campaign ending after only 4 hours of relaxed gameplay, something that so massively surprised me that, well, this was my reaction at the time.
What? Are you joking me? What in the fresh hell was that? That's ridiculous. 4 hours of campaign. What did they say to us when we were, when we first got news about this? A compelling narrative? There's no compelling narrative in that. Very much more of a tutorial than a campaign.
The rest of that day was spent on Jurassic Park Chaos Theory mode, where again the positives and negatives were shown. The new dinosaur synthesis system, for example, where batches of eggs are produced and then you select which eggs make the cut, was a much better system than the first games. There was also the amenity modification system, which I first played around with during that day 1 stream, and I found it a very well made and effective system for adding design elements to common buildings. But alongside the positives, there were problems, like more broken animation loops, bad vehicle physics that would break and catapult your jeeps around, and annoying slowdown of general gameplay caused by the scientist and tech tree systems. I think all in all, having re-watched that day 1 stream, I think I would classify my response as mixed or perhaps undecided. There were very clear definite improvements over the first game, many of which simply couldn't be ignored or discounted, and yet there were still so many problems as well. For every positive, there seemed to be a nagging negative. I should point out as well that this was only the day 1 stream, where all I tackled was the game's campaign. Out of the whole day, the general disappointing nature of the campaign, something I'll discuss more in a later section, was probably the biggest negative. However, there was far more to the game than that, and other game modes to try, so it was easily possible the game would make up for its issues within them. So that was launch day for me, but what was launch day like for Frontier?
So much for our first tour, 2 no-shows and 1 sick Triceratops.
It could have been worse, John. A lot worse.
So in order to figure this one out, I've looked at a few different things. I checked out Steam's reviews for the month of the game's release to see what folks were saying. I checked out the Jurassic World Evolution Reddit to see what the folks were saying there. I also checked out Frontier's forums to see what folks were saying there. And of course we have what Frontier themselves said about the game's launch. So let's start with the official narrative. Frontier themselves stated that the pre-order sales of Jurassic World Evolution 2 had been encouraging on all platforms, similar to the first game. However, after launch, the game did not sell as well as expected, especially on PC. Frontier themselves considered it disappointing. We can see this borne out in the Steam player figures during launch. On launch day, Jurassic World Evolution 1 launched with a peak player count of 60,000 players on Steam, and throughout its first month hit an average of about 20,000 players. Its average player count for its first 6 months was just over 5,500 people. Let's compare this to Jurassic World Evolution 2. JWE2's Steam launch showed a peak player count of just over 17,000 people with a first month average of 7,000 players. This represents a decrease of 71% in peak day 1 players and a 65% decrease in month 1 average players. The 6-month average for Jurassic World Evolution 2's player count was just over 3,000. So in terms of Steam numbers alone, Jurassic World Evolution 2 did not have a good launch day. Frontier themselves put its poor performance down to Jurassic World Evolution 2 launching alongside other big titles, such as Skyrim's Anniversary Edition, Forza Horizon 5, and the GTA trilogy. I think, however, there are some other factors at work here, especially given that Jurassic World Evolution 1 launched alongside some large titles too. Firstly, there is the obvious issue that Jurassic World Evolution 2 was launching without a movie alongside it, since Dominion had been delayed until the following year. Jurassic World Evolution 1, meanwhile, launched just before the release of Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom in cinemas. The Jurassic hype was probably a lot stronger for the first game than the second. Secondly, there was also the fact that Jurassic World Evolution 2 was launching in November, just over a month before Christmas. I can't help but think the financial demands of the festive period also played a part in Jurassic World Evolution 2's disappointing initial release. I also think that the more mixed and varied pre-release reviews that highlighted various issues with Jurassic World Evolution 2 more than the reviews had for Jurassic World Evolution 1 had probably played a part. Evolution Square, in conversation with me, also pointed out that at the time there was a general feel amongst the Jurassic World Evolution 1 player base that a second game was not needed at the time, and that there was a pushback against Jurassic World Evolution 2 being released so soon. Frontier did have a positive outlook for Jurassic World Evolution 2, however, even if its launch was disappointing. They expected Jurassic World Evolution 2's income to easily outstrip the first game, especially when Dominion launched. However, in a graph of the cumulative revenue of the game, focusing on the Evolution games, we can see how Jurassic World Evolution 2 has only ever gotten close to Jurassic World Evolution 1's revenue, and that the release of Dominion only improved its revenue rather than surpassing Jurassic World Evolution 1's. So I think it's acceptable to say that Jurassic World Evolution 2 was, as far as Frontier is concerned, a big earner, but one that also did disappoint. Next up, let's look at the player response. Looking at reviews and comments from players is always fraught with problems. Often, for a game to get a review from players, it has to be either very bad or very good, with usually the most passionate players writing them on both sides of the spectrum. There is, of course, the other matter that we as players are very different. What is annoying, disappointing, or frustrating to some players will not be to others. And of course, we all weight criticisms differently. For some, occasional bugs are not a problem. For others, bugs in a 60-quid game are unacceptable. But looking through the reviews and comments all over, there are some similar themes here. Many positive comments refer to the game's better animations, better graphical fidelity, and the various attempts to improve gameplay with added management features. But there was also a common trait that even the most positive reviews were often filled with a lot of caveats. For example, I'm quoting now from some positive Steam reviews. The game is basically just a big DLC from the first game, with extra mechanics, new dinosaurs, better graphics, and a new side story with the title of Campaign slapped on it. Anyway, the game looks beautiful and definitely has potential with help from mods if you're on PC. If you're on console, I'm really sorry. If you liked the first one, you'll probably like this one as well. It's more of the same with a few quality of life improvements as well as a few terrible game mechanics. These are a few comments from positive Steam reviews. You can see what I mean. Positive reviews, and yet the game has terrible mechanics, needs mods, or feels like a big DLC. It was difficult to find a Jurassic World Evolution 2 review that didn't include caveats. In terms of criticisms, there were also some very clear themes amongst them. The scientist system and Jurassic World Evolution 2's general management was constantly lambasted amongst the comments on Reddit and on Frontier's forums. It was clear the new system, which was implemented to add more management, was seen as merely adding grind to the game and annoying levels of micromanaging. There is also a common thread of kickback against the locking of sandbox features behind challenge or chaos theory mode, an element that the original game included and that a lot of people really disliked about the second. Attached to this was the limited features of sandbox mode, including the fact that you had to use scientists in the mode, which also annoyed players. Another trait of negativity was bugs and glitch reports. Console players experienced a lot of bugs, which included frame rate problems, load and save corruption, game crashes, and also other bugs PC players were getting. Broken shadows, broken animation loops, poor pathfinding, and broken ranger AI. Dinosaurs getting stuck and dying, lagoon fish flying through the air, and other problems were all common criticisms. I would classify then the player response to Jurassic World Evolution 2's launch was one of a distinctly mixed reaction. Positive outlooks tinged with frustration at many of the choices made by Frontier with the game's features. It was clear looking back at the reviews and comments from folks that many believed that the game had a lot of potential, but at launch felt too much like an early access title that had been launched way before it was ready.
This is how you make dinosaurs?
No. This is how you play God.
So I thought it would also be a good idea to compare the general player-based responses to the game to some of the louder voices of the Jurassic World Evolution community on YouTube. For openness, this took the form of watching the Jurassic World Evolution 2 reviews from Evolution Square, Best in Slot, Worth a Buy, and Zaid. I'm going to start by summarizing what these folks' key points were. Let's start with Evolution Square. Her review started with campaign mode, a mode she was positive about due to its fun and engaging nature and the new fast-forward controls helping to remove many of the lulls in gameplay the first game had. The range of biomes explored in the campaign was also considered a good thing, but for Evo, the shortness of the campaign with its super abrupt ending meant that it felt incomplete, and Evo was against paying for further Dominion content to be added to the game when really it should be present in the campaign. Evo also looked at the other game modes. Chaos Theory was good for nostalgia but had missed potential due to the lack of imagination for the scenarios. Challenge mode had been improved, which was positive, but the grindy nature of needing to unlock stuff for sandbox was definitely a negative for Evo, who is primarily a sandbox player. Evo also showed confusion over some choices, like missing placeable trees and having to still use scientists and the scientist system in sandbox mode. Overall, she felt that the sandbox really didn't feel like a sandbox at all due to these issues. Evo gave the game a rating of 7 out of 10. Next up is Best in Slot. His overall view was the game was better, but there were also some issues. In fact, he said something that is a really great quote. The game bangs its head on the glass ceiling of its own gameplay limitations. Like Evo, he found the campaign refreshing but too short. Chaos Theory had plenty of content, but again did not go far enough with interesting ideas or gameplay experimentation. Dinosaurs were considered a very high point for Best in Slot, and he also considered the Aviaries and Pterosaurs a success. Lagoons, however, Best in Slot was not a fan of. They were in his view boring due to the lack of customization. The new biomes were a big positive in his review, and the maps and variety of biomes really breathing new life into the game and even its animals, with the environment resulting in very different feels. levels. The only biome-specific thing he didn't like was the weather effects, criticizing that there really was no difference in effects between blizzards, sandstorms and rainstorms. There were, however, a lot of strange choices that Biz referred to that hamstrung the game's quality. The overpowered nature of pack hunting, the missing Jurassic Park era buildings, the removal of placeable trees, and the limitations of sandbox were all features that hamstrung the game for him. Best in Slot would eventually rate the game a 7.5 out of 10. Worth a Buy is a somewhat smaller channel focusing on general gaming as opposed to Jurassic content, so they can be considered an outsider's perspective. For them, Jurassic World Evolution 2 is what the first game really should have been. The dinosaurs were much better than the first game, and he praised them a lot. However, his review was generally more critical. The huge levels of micromanagement inherent in the game's systems was a significant criticism, made worse by rangers with broken pathfinding and AI. Like Best in Slot and Evo, Worth Buy also considered the grind for sandbox assets a negative and mentioned that for him, the game seemed too expensive for a mostly copy-pasted content from the first game. Worth a Buy also pointed out that he suffered a number of technical problems, including multiple crashes. His final view was a rating of 6.5 out of 10, with a final opinion that the game was enjoyable but lacked any real big innovation. The final content creator whose review I looked at was Zaid, a smaller creator. His view was probably the most critical of everyone. For him, Jurassic World Evolution 2 was full of contrived nonsense and tick box gameplay. The guests lack depth. The micromanagement is annoying and too repetitive, with the gameplay feeling hampered by constantly being in menus interrupting the game's flow. There was too much busy work that was masquerading as mechanical depth. While the game looks graphically better, Zaid also showed in his video a number of the bugs and glitches and graphical errors that he suffered during gameplay. He did not rate the game out of 10, however stated that for him, the game had far too many technical problems to make the game an immediate buy, and in general he considered it something to only get when it came on sale. In short then, these content creator reviews all had relatively similar problems with the game as well as the positives. The positives of graphics, new biomes and improvements to the animals and park building were somewhat hampered by the micromanagement, the grindy nature of the gameplay and the technical problems with the game. The game clearly had a lot of room for improvement.
Now eventually you do plan to have dinosaurs on your dinosaur tour, right? Hello? Hello? Yes?
I really hate that man.
Of course, there is one last content creator I really need to talk about. Me. A month after the game's release, I finally tackled my own review. By this time, I had played much more of the game, including a number of Chaos Theory modes, challenge modes, and built a sandbox park. My review could be summarized as, it has improved, but it's also making new errors. Like many others, I was positive about the brand new UI and the brand new biomes. In general, I considered the way the game looked far better than the first, and graphically it was a big step up. Looking at the game's main modes, I was very disappointed with the campaign, which I considered a total failure as a engaging and authentic narrative, the promise made by Rich during the game hype period. It was far too short and lacking any narrative. The cringy dialogue between the characters also really didn't help. Chaos Theory mode was a good idea on paper, however, like Best in Slot, I was disappointed by the lack of imagination used to create each scenario. They ended up feeling bland and boring. Unlike the first game, I was much more positive about challenge mode, which I considered a vast improvement. The mode played better and felt fairer. Like the other content creators, however, the locking of sandbox assets behind challenge mode play was a serious negative for me, as were the strange choices like removing placeable trees. With the basic gameplay not changing that much, I looked at new features. The scientist system came under fire immediately for being a shallow staff system with no depth and a one-dimensional nature, turning every task into a grind and micromanagement nightmare. This wasn't helped by the Ranger and Vet AI, which was buggered too. I was very positive about the customization options for the amenities, a feature I hoped would be expanded. I did also consider the animals generally better. The Aviaries were okay, but needed pterosaur specific objects. Lagoons were another area I found needed lots of improvements. Both Aviaries and Lagoons suffered from a lot of bugs and glitches, especially around around their animals, and the general technical issues that surrounded the rest of Jurassic World Evolution 2 also lowered my view of the game. I felt that the game had a lot of potential, in fact perhaps a lot more than Jurassic World Evolution 1 did, but it needed a lot more work and improvements, with me stating that Frontier would have to listen to the community and develop the game and fix the issues with its systems. I wasn't against the game, but I certainly felt like this was a repeat of the disappointment of Jurassic World Evolution 1's release. A new game, but new problems.
Taking dinosaurs off this island was the worst idea in the long, sad history of bad ideas, and I'm going to be there when you learn that.
So what can we say about Jurassic World Evolution 2's launch? I think it's fair to say that Frontier rather fumbled, and I think it all started even before launch day. The game's marketing just wasn't very good. So much of the pre-release information we got failed to highlight the key ways the game would be fundamentally different to the first, with very little focus on Aviaries or Lagoons. Not to mention that every stream where they reveal gameplay made it seem like none of them had ever actually played the game, given how poorly they managed it. Then you have the fact that the game was releasing without movie hype to help it, just before Christmas, surrounded by bigger, better, less niche game titles. All this, I think, contributed to that low sales count and very reduced initial peak player base. Then it fumbled with the game itself. All the early reviews, comments and discussions have similar threads within them, that the game showed good improvements over the first in many areas, with aspects like the animals, the graphics and the biome system all being praised in most reviews. However, there was a great deal of negatives too, many of them quite game-breaking. Almost all of the new features, like the scientist system, Lagoons, and the new Chaos Theory game mode, were considered less than successful, with some aspects damn right annoying. The strange choices made, such as the removal of core Jurassic World Evolution 1 features, confused many. However, I think it was the technical problems that really damaged those early days. The constant nature of bugs and glitches and problems. Frontier's forums at the time are full of them. I suffered many, much like Zaid did. Console players found the game equally technically problematic, with early day issues making the game almost totally unplayable on PS4. It felt like the game had been launched without testing or any sort of quality assurance at all. But as many say, that was all in the past. So how did Jurassic World Evolution 2 evolve beyond its opening struggles, and what did it become? Well, let's tackle that in the next chapter. So in this chapter, we will be looking at the base nature of Jurassic World Evolution 3 as it stands today, as well as discussing the game's updates and patches to see what the game's broad nature is. We will look at the specific game modes and specific aspects of the game in future chapters. First, let's get a broad baseline. Also, for interest, I replayed the game's campaign, several chaos theories, and a challenge mode in preparation for these next chapters.
Oh yeah, that's how it always starts. But then later there's running and screaming.
So to start with, let's take a very broad look at the game and its gameplay before we dive in and start pulling things out. The first thing to talk about, and something I will continue to beat a drum about, is just how much better the game's UI and general appearance is compared to the first game. Gameplay 101 is really ensuring that your UI is easy to use and read, and Jurassic World Evolution 2's new UI is far superior to the first game's. Not only is the new command bar neater, but the double stacked menus that require less scrolling through, as well as the new selection system for building eras, really helps to make the basics of park building easier. Also attached to this is the new submenus for environmental alteration and for decoration. The decorations menu was added in an update, which we will discuss in the next part, but for both of these submenus now in game, it again helps to keep all of those neat and easy to use. From a broad perspective, praise also has to be made for the graphical look of the game. Worthaby in his review, which I discussed in the last chapter, said he really couldn't tell any difference between Jurassic World Evolution 1 and Jurassic World Evolution 2. Is he blind? It is very clear the second game has been graphically improved, but I think the issue is that the improvements are in a number of very subtle ways. For example, dinosaur textures having a higher resolution now, buildings are more crisp in their models, lighting has been massively improved, as has the appearance of the environmental water. Foliage also comes in much larger varieties of shape and size. Textures, generally on ground textures, have also been improved. All combined, it creates a very different look for Jurassic World Evolution 2. Even if you compare the tropical islands in the second game to the first, it's clear where the differences are. In terms of the basics of gameplay, the two games have not altered that dramatically. Constructing the parks, whether they're tourist focused in the Chaos Theory mode or facility focused in the campaign, is basically the same as the first game. Basic buildings for the parks are broadly similar, with structures for research, fossil acquisition and DNA generation all present. One key difference between the first game and the second is that now we have broader control of where our park entrances are located, which makes a nice change from the forced monorail positions of the first game. Animal creation is still conducted in hatcheries, much like the first game, and the broad strokes of guest happiness in the form of amenities, hotels and restrooms is also broadly similar, with some changes to the amenities which we'll discuss in a later chapter. Whatever game mode you play, broadly things follow the same loop as the first game. Whatever animals you create or acquire for your parks or facilities must be housed securely, with the obvious differences being the addition of aviary and lagoon animals and their specialist facilities. One key area of difference from the original game is changes to animal needs, with a greater range of features needed to maintain animal happiness. Something that is a vast improvement over the first game is the fact that you now don't have to perfect all of the bars, and instead the animals will be more accepting of a near enough enclosure without it needing to be perfect across all aspects. This does make looking after some of the more annoying animals from the first game easier. I will be looking more into animal management in a future chapter. There have also been some broad improvements which I would classify as quality of life. For example, instead of having an ACU building and a ranger building, Jurassic World Evolution 2 combines them together into a single building, saving space and income. In fact, there seems to have been a broad rebalancing of the costs of structures in Jurassic World Evolution 2, which certainly goes a long way in making challenge mode somewhat better. There has also been a general rescaling of buildings to make them less enormous and fit better with parks, which again goes a long way in helping the dreaded terrain constraints. Outside of campaign, gaining star rating has changed between the first and second games. While the first game created an overall rating based off your animals and facilities, the second game streamlines this system to focus solely on the income your park generates. Now, I will be talking more about this later, but in some respects I do like this. Basing it solely off income does make the tendency of a park's star rating to suddenly fluctuate wildly, a trait of the first game's parks, less likely. But as I said, there is more I want to say about this in a minute. General environmental modification remains broadly the same as the first game, with some minor changes. Water will now not be removed thanks to a change in how the game works around the height of surrounding terrain, a trait I fully support. We also have a few new options, like the terrain auto painting, which adds terrain texture for you. Another significant area of change is the application of the new foliage system, which combines paleobotany into the vegetation planting system. Again, I think there are good and bad parts to this. Strictly looking at what is good, being able to feed herbivores without the need of feeders and for animals to actually eat the plants we enclose with them is better than the feeder dependent system of the first game. But there are some things I don't like about it, but again, more on that later. Now, before we discuss other topics, I think it's worth taking some time to consider the updates and patches the game received, as much of the initial day one issues I had with the game were in some cases fixed by these updates. These updates also failed to fix some elements that I'm still critical of.
Item 151 on today's glitch list. We have all the problems of a major theme park and a major zoo, and the computers aren't even on their feet yet.
So following the game's initial release, a number of important updates and patches were added to the game, which did in some cases fix many of the criticisms I had on day one, but also failed to correct some issues which I'll be discussing shortly. Now, I'm not going to go into huge detail about all these updates, instead I'm going to focus on the important ones, and please note that I am discussing the free updates here, not the paid DLC. December 9th, around a month after release, is the first update to discuss, discuss. This added DFW themed and Jurassic Park themed structures that were missing on day one, such as lagoon and aviary designs, power plants and hotels. This tackled one of the initial criticisms that building sets were incomplete and prevented using some animals in some sandbox plays. This update also introduced sandbox maps based off the campaign maps and added some options to sandbox mode, such as the ability to set combat frequency to ensure that we could finally have animals living together without killing one another. There were other things added with this update, but for me those were the most important aspects since they directly tackled some of the day one criticisms players had. Next important free update was March 8th. This update introduced the species viewer to the game, an attempt to tackle the criticisms of the skin system, finally giving us the ability to view all animal skins in the game. But of greater worth was the massive expansion to the game's decorations, adding a huge number of items such as cages, banners, fountains, planters and skeletons. It also reintroduced the placeable vegetation that was weirdly missing. 5 months to have a Jurassic World Evolution 1 feature re-added. This will be a theme in these updates. Also included in the March update was a bunch of new upgrades to buildings to try to assist with general gameplay, access to all buildings in sandbox mode, the options to turn scientists, expeditions, research and more off in sandbox mode. Again, this update brought a lot of changes, but I think the massive amount of decorations that this update added is the most important part of this update. Next important was June 14th, where we got some more quality of life additions to sandbox mode, such as turning off dinosaur injuries. We also got some rebalancing of dinosaur cohabitation needs to make some animals easier to handle. But by far the biggest change here was allowing park tours, such as the Gyrosphere or Jurassic Tour, to function as transport like the monorail, allowing more interesting park and challenge modes. September 15th, 2022 was the next significant update, which not only added some much needed animations to the lagoon animals, having them attacking the walls when they're unhappy, but also to pterosaurs, allowing them to attack ranger and ACU vehicles. But by far the biggest and most important addition were lagoon decorations for the interior and exterior of the lagoon, finally letting us design those ugly concrete pools. Shame it took nearly a year. The next important update as far as I'm concerned was in March 2023, where we got the new viewing log and dome building and square maps for sandbox. However, all that pales in comparison to the most important thing this update did. Perhaps the most important thing any update has done. It finally added the option to enable unlimited feeders on sandbox mode. Let joy be unconfined. Finally, one of the most basic Jurassic World Evolution 1 sandbox features finally added. This was followed by the June 8th update that gave us yet more decorations based off the original films. August 10th added the new challenge mode options, added the lagoon viewing dome, and added the option to cosmetically damage buildings and to disable guest deaths. Then on the second year anniversary, we got the new pre-built layouts for some maps, but even more important were the benches. Followed on May 16th, 2024 with the update that gave us fucking kelp. Oh yeah, it doesn't get better than this. Now, on the whole, all of these updates were very important for the game. They added more content, improved on established game modes, especially sandbox, provided quality of life improvements, and tackled some of the criticisms with the game, and that should not be ignored. Well done.
Yes, well done, Slytherin, however.
Ah, thank you, Dumbledore. Yes, there is a but. And it's this. Many of these updates consisted of re-adding features available in the first game that were then for some explicable reason removed. Other updates added features that really should have been there to start with. Why, for example, did it take so long to give the aquatic animals basic animations? Why did we have to have very basic decorations like fountains and benches added in months and months after release? Why did the option to build parks on the campaign maps have to be added in? How much of what the updates did could be described as bringing the game up to a bare minimum standard for games of this type? We all rather sarcastically praised the addition of kelp plants for the lagoons, but seriously, why the hell did it take so long? Getting heated, and we haven't even got to the more extreme stuff yet. Not a good sign for the future. The point is, these updates, while they gave us exactly what the game needed, And while Frontier should be given some points for listening and being mindful enough to provide the fixes the game needed, they also at the same time lose points for failing to do these very bare minimum things with the game before it was even released. And hereupon I have a question, which we will touch on moving on from here. It can be assumed that Jurassic World Evolution 2 was in development for at least 2 years, pretty standard for Frontier games. Much of Jurassic World Evolution 1 was copy and pasted over. Much of the roster was already made, many buildings already built. I think it's fair to say that at least a third of the game was already in existence prior to development starting. Thus my question, why were so many of these features that got added in updates simply not there prior to release? Was this due to Frontier investing too much time on other things, caused by a shortage of staff, or caused by Universal's interference? Since we're on a critical tone, let's tackle what remains not so good about the game from a broad perspective.
Eddie?
You really came all that way in
What?
this trailer?
Why in the hell doesn't this thing ever work?
You know, it's not a landline. You know, you're not in a phone booth. You gotta wait for a decent signal.
So in terms of broad gameplay, what remains not so good about Jurassic World Evolution 2? Well, let's start with the guests and people in the park. What a total waste of space these particle effects are. Guests are amongst the most pointless elements in this park building game. Like the first game, they do nothing. They walk around, they point. They die in repetitive animations, and that's it. What is even more funny, in a really piss-taking way, is that guests don't even sit on the benches and seating that was so grandly added to the game. A feature, I inform you, that Jurassic Park Operation Genesis had 20 years ago. The ability to have guests actually use the seating. And what's worse, and touching on something we will discuss more shortly, is that these guests, these pointless particle effects, totally tank park performance. Those of us who make large parks, such as myself in Evolution Square, routinely have to shut our parks in order to maintain performance because the guests are so much of a performance drain on the game engine. How has that even occurred when they don't do anything? Now, the new star rating method, where it was attached to park income only, was, as I stated some paragraphs ago, a good thing. Mostly. See, I think it's one of those features that rests on the fence. While linking it to a physical value that we can track is good, it also results in a very reductionist system for the star rating. Now you no longer really have to worry about your facility rating or your park's dinosaur rating, because all you need to do is make money. Moreover, they attach the star rating to money, but actively removed the ability to affect the park's money-making ability. Unlike the first game, we have no financial controls over the bathrooms or amenities, and we still can't change the price of admission or entry to attractions. So while I think altering the system to run on something clear was a good thing, overall I think it's been implemented in a very ham-fisted and reductionist way. And this directly leads on to one of the biggest areas that I'm broadly critical of in terms of the game's general gameplay. Jurassic World Evolution 2 did make attempts to improve the way we manage the parks, but for a park building game, it's still pretty woeful. Even by Frontier's own standards, let alone the standards of other older park builders or newer titles. So much of the management that was added, such as the scientist system, the new tech tree, and the ranger vet systems, were all implemented in a very bad way. While I want to discuss the new additions that came to Jurassic World Evolution 2 in more detail in a later chapter, I think it's fair to say that in terms of broad gameplay, many of the so-called management features added to the game became the most hated aspects. The scientist system especially was lamented from day one and never altered. The ranger and vet system still struggles due to bad pathfinding and AI. The new tech tree feels restrictive. I don't understand how Frontier, a company that made a game like Planet Coaster or Planet Zoo, where managing the park and its staff takes a front row seat alongside the park building, can struggle to implement management into this game without it becoming a chore or a tedious addition. And again, we come back to the question, is this Universal's fault or a sign of Frontier rushing the game out the door? Why did it end up like this? Surely they know what a good park management feature in a game like this looks like. Take another new feature that they added, paleobotany. It was a good feature in theory, and worthy of the praise I mentioned a few paragraphs ago, but in implementation, like so much of this game, it was done badly. First, you have the problem that some species of animals have ridiculous requirements that mean your enclosures become a mess of paleo plants in order to manage their needs. This was a day one issue that still remains a problem. Additionally to that is a larger problem that some of the foliage really doesn't look right. Take the example in the campaign, where you have to plant paleo plants in the deserts of Arizona for the Stegosaurus, consisting of these brightly coloured tall cycad plants. It gets even worse if you have sauropods and therefore have to plant actual huge trees that really don't match a desert environment. There were ways around this, such as allowing food requirements to be handled by non-paleo trees, or perhaps giving us some model variation of paleo food which suited the environments better. Finally, losing the system from the first game meant that a system that did actually add some depth to gameplay, picking the right plants to grow, providing the right plant combinations to certain herbivore groupings, was lost. Instead, replaced by a system that in theory worked better, but also removed gameplay and nuance. In general, what I would say about the broad gameplay is that while there were attempts made to expand the game, the systems, and the content from the first game, and attempts made to tackle the first game's deficiencies, it also feels like there was a lack of innovation in the broad gameplay. What innovations exist are badly implemented, too reductionist, too simplistic, or straight up bloody awful, and areas that needed large scale innovation, such as park management, didn't get it, resulting in the second game feeling too similar to the first in a wide number of areas. However, all of this has to be put aside for the area of the game that I think, very broadly, is the biggest problem.
That is one big pile of shit.
This game runs like shit. Sorry, let me try that one again. Fuck me, does this game run like shit. One of Jurassic World Evolution 1's few positive aspects was that the game felt well put together. Sure, it was a bland, boring sponge cake with no flavour, but it was damn moist in the middle. Jurassic World Evolution 2, meanwhile, is a cake that looks great on the outside, but when you slice into it you discover it's full of mould and maggots. Jurassic World Evolution 2's general performance is about as smooth as the Titanic hitting the iceberg. It's about as smooth as falling down a flight of stairs with a glass vase. Seriously, I have no end to these tortured similes. But seriously, it runs really badly. My rig is what I would consider a mid-range, average sort of thing. It cost over £1,000 and was specifically designed to meet the system requirements of Jurassic World Evolution 2 when I brought it. In every single meaningful aspect, my rig matches or exceeds the minimum and recommended requirements as Frontier listed on Steam. And yet, Jurassic World Evolution 2, a game that I don't consider graphically intensive, runs like shit. In order to run Jurassic World Evolution 2 at anything near a stable frame rate, I have to run the game at lower settings than it itself tells me I can run the game at. I have to run the game with Nvidia's render upscaling system, DLSS, turned on. And still the game chugs like it's drinking a killer whale spunk milkshake when there's too many guests in the park, or if the park gets a bit too big, or there's too many animals. The complete inability of this game to maintain a constant 60 FPS is poor, and that for me is the bare minimum in terms of modern gaming. And if the shit optimization wasn't bad enough, the game is full of so many bugs you'd think the game sees bugs and glitches like Pokemon and wants to catch them all. So many day one bugs still remain in the game. The persistence of animals phasing through fences, animals getting stuck and dying of starvation, or being unable to be scanned and moved are constant day one niggles that remain present in the game and routinely aggravate even sandbox play. One bug I particularly hate is the inability for the game to show you when terrain is not all flat, with a strange sort of half level located between each contour. Again, it aggravates building on sandbox. There's so many bugs and glitches that this game still has that it would be almost worthy of a video on its own. Add that to the performance problems and the game feels like it's been made by bloody Bethesda, only it's not funny.
No one's impressed by a dinosaur anymore. 20 years ago, de-extinction was right up there with magic. These days, kids look at a stegosaurus like an elephant from the city zoo.
So what can we say about the general gameplay and the broad experience? Well, in some ways the game has certainly improved on the basic Jurassic World Evolution 1 experience, and multiple free updates did develop on that basic experience more. Improvements were made, and that should not be ignored. But the basic experience is still in some respects limited, and shows flaws in many areas, such as the poor performance, and the way some features have been implemented in ways that lead to frustrations. And as I said, while the updates were certainly good, it cannot be ignored that many were merely about re-adding basic features or including elements that most park builders would have as standard. So having had a look at the broad aspects of the game, let's start looking at various things in much more detail. And I think we'll start with the game modes. With the basics of gameplay investigated, let's move on to a careful look at the game modes. I will not be discussing Sandbox here as we discussed it in the previous chapter, and please note I will be looking at the DLC campaigns in the DLC chapter.
This means that dinosaurs and humanity have to find a way to work out their differences.
So let's start with the campaign. The background to the mode is fairly simple, attempting to bridge the gap between Fallen Kingdom and Jurassic World Dominion. It establishes that dinosaurs have spread all over the USA, and it's our job to deal with it. Again, much like the movie, the game fails to establish how a dozen animals escaping a mansion causes a countrywide pandemic of dinosaurs, but alas, we will leave that rather large plot contrivance for now. We take the position of building facilities working on behalf of America's Department of Fish and Wildlife, and alongside us will be some returning cast and characters. Claire Dearing returns, voiced by Bruce Dallas Howard, and Jeff Goldblum returns to voice Ian Malcolm. They are, rather unfortunately, the only two members of the original cast that returns. Owen Grady is again voiced by A.J. Locascio, who voiced him in Jurassic World Evolution 1. The campaign also sees the return of Cabot Finch, Dr. Dewar, Lambert and Isaac, our group leaders from the first game. There is very little, however, that the voice cast can do to save this game mode. To be honest, most of them are rather more grating and annoying than nice to have. Cabot is somehow more annoying than he ever was, and the attempts to make Owen funny always falls flat. As for the three former division leaders, who the hell cares? No one liked them from Jurassic World Evolution 1 as it was. Making Dewar now a member of the CIA doesn't make her character more interesting, because these people have no character. Not to mention, surely that's a conflict of interest. Having a former Jurassic World staff working for you on the dinosaur issue? Why not just go and hire Dr. Wu at that point? And like I said, most of these people are not really characters. They just speak an occasional voice line now and then. The campaign sees us travel to 5 different locations around the USA and tasks us with constructing facilities in those areas to deal with various dinosaur-related problems that occur. It's a very different style of campaign to the first game. There's no island hopping, no sharing of facilities. Instead, it's a much more linear sort of campaign. Each map provides you a basic list of objectives which you have to complete to progress, and once they're all done, you just move on to the next map. It's a very straight line, linear experience. Now that would be fine if the campaign felt worth playing, and did use that linearity to tell a narrative, which was the claim we were all told. The problem is that it really doesn't. In my view, having replayed it, I concretely believe that this campaign is actually, and was actually, always just a tutorial. Why do I think this? Well, let me explain. The campaign is ridiculously short. Even taking time during the re-recording, I completed the 5 missions in just over 2 hours. That is very short for something calling itself a campaign. In fact, I think it's pretty insulting that on day 1 they even tried to call this a campaign. It remains insulting. The next point is that the whole thing is actually built like a tutorial. You can see this if I summarize what each map is about and what it teaches. Arizona is your first mission. You are shown the basics of using the vehicles, creating enclosures, and conducting expeditions. Washington is all about using the vehicles more, creating a facility from scratch, and introduces you to the Paleo Vet system. Pennsylvania again has you build a more substantial facility from scratch, has you focus more on expeditions and the Paleo Vet system, and has a greater focus on the research tech tree. Oregon teaches you the basics of the Aviary system and pterosaur care, and Yosemite is a final mission where everything you have learned is brought together. So in Formation, the campaign teaches you the basic knowledge needed to complete the other facility-based campaigns, which I think were never meant to be DLC, and were in fact always meant to be shipped with the game to start with. More on this later when I talk about the DLC. As for narrative, well, it doesn't have one. I think Frontier needs to learn what narrative actually is. A well-constructed narrative is not just a story or some random voice lines from shallow characters. A narrative is constructed from various elements. Its characters face challenges, develop relationships, and hopefully change and grow into new characters. There should be clear acts leading to a significant conclusion. There should be drama, tragedy, conflict, and resolution. That is how traditional narratives function. That is not what this campaign is. What it has are occasional voice lines from characters, which is masquerading as some sort of plot. And to be honest, in combination, everything we have would only really make a very shallow Act 1 of a larger narrative. But that's being kind to it. There really is very little here, and very little to get invested in, especially when most of the voice lines are just more demands for you to build or do whatever the next objective is. It simply isn't a story. There's no drama, no conflict, no resolution, no sudden revelations or tragedies. Hell, Claire and Owen don't even mention the fact that they were part of the events that led to the animals escaping. There's no discussion of what Clone Child did, no discussion of their parts in any of it beyond some references to the first film. They can't even make use of the narratives that already exist, let alone make their own. It really is laughable. The best thing that I can say about the tutorial, since that is what it is that it's fast, teaches the basic elements needed moving forwards, and it is at least engaging. While Jurassic World Evolution 1's campaign could certainly feel like a bit of a drag, and could at times feel repetitive, Jurassic World Evolution 2's campaign feels different instantly and proceeds at pace, so you do feel engaged, at least in that way. There are also several glimpses at what really could have been. The first of these occurs in Washington, where a prolonged Ranger Jeep search, itself a rather unique element to this map, and something I actually enjoyed and would have liked to do more, rapidly changes to a helicopter chase as you're ambushed by an Allosaurus announced with a cutscene. This feels, for want of a better term, like a very cinematic moment that really would have suited a narrative-focused campaign, but it remains the only one in the whole game. It feels like a massively wasted opportunity to not do this sort of cinematic thing more. Same goes for the scripted storms that hit in the first mission and the third mission. These both feel like they could have been used for cinematic scripted moments as part of a narrative, and yet they just happen. In fact, when the tornado hits your facility in Mission 3, not a single character even mentions it. Instead of using these events as part of a story, like in fact the original films did, the game just has them happen and never really interacts with them. Overall then, the limited campaign, which was only ever a tutorial, remains for me a huge missed opportunity to create something really interesting to fill in that missing gap between the second and third Jurassic World films. We were told that we would get a unique and original narrative story. Instead, we got a short set of maps, which function mechanically as a tutorial that merely set up the DLC campaigns, which is where I think the true campaigns were sold back to us.
The full 50 miles of perimeter fence are in place.
And the concrete nodes and the motion sensor tracking systems. Donald's dear boy, relax. Try and enjoy yourself.
So on to Chaos Theory. Now this was another mode that the devs spoke about during the pre-release hype phase. The idea is relatively simple. Alternative scenarios, based on each of the current films, essentially a set of what-if scenarios. It was assumed by me when I heard about these that they too would have some degree of original narrative set to them. Unfortunately, chaos theory has a problem: its complete lack of imagination. To start with explaining this, let's start with what was, for me, the best DLC for Jurassic World Evolution 1. The Return to Jurassic Park DLC for the first game is widely considered one of the best DLCs from that first title. It had a very simple premise. What if after the events of the film, Hammond convinced the cast to return to him to Nublar to correct the problems and make it a success? Not only did the DLC bring huge amounts of content for the game, but also came with unique gameplay traits. No viewing structures at all, only the Jurassic Tour ride, and it altered how we built our parks. The addition of the Aviary was unique for it, and the limited dinosaur selection also made this feel very different to the conventional game. In many respects, this DLC could be seen as a prototype of the Chaos Theory modes. However, I would argue that none of the Chaos Theory maps match the level of the Return to Jurassic Park DLC, and in fact for me, I would consider the whole game mode a total failure. Let's start with summarising what each of the maps have you do. Jurassic Park has you build a park and run it. The Lost World has you build the San Diego Park and run it. Jurassic Park 3 has you tranquilise some dinosaurs. Jurassic World has you build the park and run it. Fallen Kingdom has you drive around a bit, scan some animals, and then delete everything. Dominion has you engage in a sort of tower defense to set up and protect your animals. So already we have a problem. Half of the scenarios are just focused around building a park. The same thing that we've already been doing in challenge mode, and to a lesser extent, facility building. The others focus around very monotonous tasks, i.e. tranquilize these dinosaurs and move them. The only one that shows any level of attempt to create a unique gameplay experience is the Dominion one. And what's worse is that for the Lost World and Jurassic Park maps, you don't even get to use the Aviaries or the Lagoons, which is a very strange choice given they added Jurassic Park era Aviaries and Lagoons. Worse still, with the game adding new additional attraction structures to the Jurassic Park build set, like the new viewing galleries and viewing towers, it means the unique park building element of only using the tour has been lost. So the park building feels exactly the same as building in the Jurassic World era. Then we have the next problem. These chaos maps are supposed to latch onto our nostalgia for the movies, which will invest us in playing these maps, but they don't really actually do it very well. For example, I replayed some of the Jurassic Park, Lost World and Jurassic Park 3 Chaos Theory. The Jurassic Park map has you working alongside Hammond and Dr. Wu, yes, but that's all. None of the rest of the cast has been brought back. This also applies to the Lost World. While the Jurassic World maps have the advantage of Bruce Dallas Howard, Owen Grady, Dr. Wu and Simon Masrani to use as characters, the Jurassic Park versions have the bank on using the random original characters Lily Halford and Ron Thompson. Random characters with no connection to the films, and they are also characters that are pretty cookie cutter that bring nothing interesting. More still, the Jurassic Park 3 map has you working with Masrani and Wu circa Jurassic World. Talk about sticking a middle finger up to the third Jurassic Park movie. While there are some minor nostalgic elements to all of them, it's not enough to make them interesting or immersive. There is content here. The park building focused maps can easily take multiple hours to complete, and I would guess that if you wanted to complete all of the Chaos Theory maps, you are probably looking at an additional 10 to 20 hours of content, depending on how fast you play and how decorative you make the parks. But the fact is that it all feels too repetitive. There's nothing new or unique here, no really great imaginative ideas on display. It feels like they went with the most obvious suggestions of what to do for each film with little care to make the mode unique or interesting. It's a shame, because there could have been something very interesting if they had really leaned on the alternative history storytelling potential of this mode and actually created a narrative. For example, instead of making each one feel separate, why not join them all together in a singular narrative telling an alternative story of Hammond and Jurassic Park's worldwide and long-term success? Or why not come up with some more interesting missions? In Jurassic Park 3, for example, why not have the players use the chopper and ranger driving skills to track down the lost group, exploring the island looking for clues, and hopefully rescuing Alan Grant and the others? The purpose of this mode was supposed to tell new stories based on the films, not just build some parks. There was so much potential here, but as usual for Frontier in this game, they totally missed it. By focusing so heavily on the basic game experience of park or facility building, it means that not only does the game mode feel repetitive with each of the maps you play, but it also feels that all the problems from the base game are here too. The bugs, the glitches, the annoying micromanagement, the grindy gameplay, the contrived nonsense masquerading as gameplay, and the rest. It's too much of the same, and I'm just not here for that.
Then you can go and look for him. Or you can stick with us as long as you don't hold us up. Either way, you probably won't get off this island alive.
So for my replay of challenge mode, I spent a bit of time tackling a standard map in easy difficulty, and I tackled one of the unique map ideas as well. And there is stuff that is positive here. Challenge mode in Jurassic World Evolution 1 was a tedious waste of time. I really hated it. The mode added nothing to the game beyond a few skins, and it just wasn't worth it. Challenge mode in Jurassic World Evolution 2, meanwhile, feels a lot different. Rebalanced, the easy and medium difficulties feel exactly like a standard Jurassic World Evolution 1 campaign map. Sure, you do have to complete all the research tasks again each time, and sure, the gameplay doesn't really change, at least not for the maps we got on release, but the fact is that it does feel a lot more fair, and that makes it easier to play. There is probably a reason for that. Before updates unlocked everything for people in Sandbox, those of us who brought the game day one had to use this mode to grind for content to use in Sandbox. I'm still salty about that choice, by the way. As a result, I suspect they made challenge mode a little easier so that we could use it for unlocking content. Actually, bear with me a moment.
And now for something completely different.
Just before I go on with challenge mode, I just want to briefly discuss that choice to lock sandbox content behind challenge and other game modes. It was such a hated feature of the game on release for a good reason. JWE1 had eventually unlocked sandbox content for everyone, regardless of them playing the campaign, towards the end of its development. We had hopes that they wouldn't make that silly choice again for the next game, but alas, they did. Now I have no problem with playing other game modes to unlock content. I think it incentivizes people to play those other game modes, instead of just running straight to sandbox. However, what really, and I mean really, pisses me off is Frontier removing that choice after only a few months, because it shows that Frontier were not willing to defend or stand by the choice they made in the first place. They simply annoyed those of us who brought the game on day one and made us grind just for a laugh. By removing the need to earn sandbox content in other game modes, it demonstrates that they had no significant gameplay or progression reason for doing it in the first place. They simply did it to force those who brought the game early to grind. Frankly, there's no middle finger big enough for that. Right, where were we?
Alan.
So, back to challenge mode. What has also improved the mode were update changes that work to reduce, not all, of the tedious interactions. The ability to connect a paleo vet truck to a ranger post inside enclosures means the process of scanning and helping sick animals can be a little more automated, and actually half functions without annoying levels of micromanagement. It's a small change, but it has helped, and more on this in later chapters. The thing is, however, that it can't be denied that, as with most of the Chaos Theory maps, challenge mode maps do have you repeating the same things over and over. While harder difficulties add some unique elements to make them harder, it never quite evolves into unique gameplay territory, which is what you would expect from a challenge mode. But did this change with the new maps that got added later? Well, I tackled one of them in order to find out. I chose to tackle the Isla Sorna map, which has you creating a wild safari park with limitations on where you can build. It is essentially kind of like playing Isla Pena from the first game. We have a lot of restrictions on space, so it's all about making use of that space as effectively as possible, while taking advantage of the ability for park tours to connect together as transport. While much of the building and gathering dinosaurs occurs like the other game modes, the restrictive space and dominance of a tour ride for the attraction does at least create some alternative park building challenges. In my view, this is what challenge mode maps should be. Instead of just simple park building that follows the same processes, the maps should have very distinct, unique challenges and elements. I hope that the third game comes as standard with this form of challenge mode.
It was a lie. Bastard! It was all a lie!
So in terms of the basic game modes, what can I conclude? Well, firstly, the super short campaign will remain a very poor display from Frontier, especially given the campaigns that games like Planet Zoo had. While the DLC certainly added campaign to it, base game it just wasn't and still isn't good enough. Chaos Theory mode was a good idea in theory, but poorly executed, with very unimaginative ideas, which fundamentally failed to provide the same level of nostalgia when compared to the first attempt, the Return to Jurassic Park DLC. For the Chaos Theory maps that were not based on building parks, they also showed a distinct lack of imagination and worse still, feel like merely very bland box-ticking missions only there to fill up the roster of the films. Challenge mode is the one mode that has seen the most improvement, not only from the first game but also from day one. The additional new maps added in free updates that offer slightly different experiences to the standard build-a-park gameplay of the base game maps certainly goes a long way to help. However, there are still some areas that could be improved. One of the issues that this game shares with the first game about this mode is that the rewards for completing the base game maps are still very limited and do not really provide much stimulus for completing them. I also think that having 4 sets of rewards, one for each difficulty, makes these rewards worse, given that higher difficulties do not provide a more significant reward. An easy way to correct this in the next game might be to have fewer rewards, limited to say skins for easy and medium difficulty, and a more significant reward for higher difficulties. Of course, that wouldn't be necessary if all the challenge modes were more like the second generation challenge maps and not the first. However, fundamentally, all these game modes suffer as a result of the larger, basic gameplay which the game has, and all of the problems inherent within it. So, what's next? Well, I think it's time we looked at our attractions. This is perhaps the most important part of any dinosaur game. The animals really are what should set this game apart from the other park builders, such as Planet Zoo. So let's look at those animals brought back to life.
T-Rex?
Mm-hmm.
You said you've got a T-Rex?
Uh-huh. Say again. We have a T-Rex.
So let's start with looking at the roster of animals that we have to play with. In total, if you include all of the game's DLCs, Jurassic World Evolution 2 features a grand total of 122 animals, divided between 96 terrestrial animals, 12 aviary animals, and 14 aquatic animals. This is in comparison to Jurassic World Evolution 1's 68 animals. So we have about double the roster of species. Of course, however, it is worth remembering that those 68 animals from the first game make up a grand majority of those 96 terrestrial animals. So if we take those animals away, Jurassic World Evolution 2 provides us 29 new terrestrial animals, along with the aquatics and the flying animals. However, if you remove the DLCs entirely, then Jurassic World Evolution 2 only features 67 terrestrial animals, with only 4 of those animals being new. So in other words, almost the entirety of Jurassic World Evolution 2's terrestrial base game roster is a copy-paste job, with most new animals restricted to the DLCs. So in terms of the animals, what do we actually have? What I've done is spend some time figuring out how many animals of each grouping of terrestrial prehistoric animal we actually have, as I think it establishes some interesting features. Some family groups are very well represented. We have a large variety of sauropods and ceratopsians. Hadrosaurs and iguanodontids are also well represented, with 9 species in the game. Medium-sized theropods are among the most numerous group, including animals like Megalosaurus and Baryonyx. However, this chart also shows some interesting elements. We have very few Ornithomimidae in the game, limited to just 4 animals. We also have only 4 species of Pachycephalosaur. In fact, we have more hybrids than we do Pachycephalosaurs. While the terrestrial animal roster is numerous and features animals both well known and less well known, there are still some strange oddities in here. For example, there's a number of reasonably well-known animals missing. We have 0 representation of the prosauropod, now more scientifically referred to as the basal sauropodomorph family group, which includes the very famous Triassic period animal Plateosaurus, one of the largest dinosaurs around during the Triassic period. We are also missing some more well-known sauropods, like Argentinosaurus and Saltosaurus, the giant hadrosaur Shatungosaurus, the stegosaur Myragaia, the Diabloceratops Centrosaurus and Psittacosaurus. These are just some of the most well-known animals that we have missing from the roster. It results in a roster that is very weighted towards Cretaceous period animals at the cost of the Jurassic period, and contains very few animals from the Triassic or before. I also have criticisms of the game's DLC roster, but more on that in the next chapter. While the roster is certainly very varied in name, in terms of general look or distinctive features, many animals are very similar in shape and size, with little to make them distinctive. This has been my long-standing issue with several sets of animals. Maiasaura, Iguanodon and Edmontosaurus, for example. You can also pair up animals like Parasaurolophus, Olorotitan and Syntausaurus as being very similar. The same problem exists with Chunkingosaurus, Huangosaurus and Gigantospinosaurus. Sometimes this can make animals feel rather pointless at first glance. For example, why would you need 3 stegosaurs, all of very similar size and shape with similar decorative spikes? Now, I suppose the answer here is, why not? My problem with that idea of thinking is that where does that end? Until you have all 700 to 800 odd species of dinosaur, the game has to be by default selective with its animal choices. I think the terrestrial roster could have been a little fairer to some time periods, and could have selected some animals that offer something more than just another similar creature. In terms of the aviary animals, there are also some very odd choices here. For example, the Ceridactylus and Marodactylus, which just function as worse versions of Pteranodon and Tropiognathus. Barbaridactylus, which is based on some very fragmentary remains, is also here. There are some good species, such as the ornate Tapijara and the DLC-specific Thanatos Dracon. However, I find it odd that some more well-known and distinctive species are not here. Nyctosaurus, for example, with its very strange crest shape, is totally missing. I think it's even worse that 4 of the 6 base game pterosaurs come from the same fossil beds in Brazil. I think a wider variety of pterosaurs from around the world should have been considered. In terms of aviary species, the base game comes with 6 animals out of a grand total of 12. I think this is a fair arrangement, a 50-50 split of animals here, with the DLC animals adding further depth to the roster, including small, medium and large animals, and brings in other dig sites. A final point about the aviary species I want to include here, which I think is a small negative, is that with the ability to include flying animals, the choices we got were all pterosaurs. No early birds came to the game, and no avian dinosaurs like Archaeopteryx or Microraptor were added, which is a big surprise to me given the focus on feathered animals in many of the DLCs. I hope that the third game brings some of these very important members of the dinosaur family tree to the game. The Aquatics are next. These are a wide range of types, including animals of different shapes and sizes amongst all sorts of aquatic animal groups. In my view, considering the total number of animals for this habitat type we have, I think the aquatic roster shows the most variation in size, type and style. However, much of that variation is sealed within DLCs. The base game featured 6 animals, split between Ichthyosaurus, Plesiosaurs and Mosasaurs. Including the DLCs, we have 14 animals in total, incorporating predatory fish, semi-aquatic reptiles, and expansions on the other marine groups. One slight issue with the aquatic roster, like the terrestrial roster, and the aviary roster, there are some animals that feel too similar to one another, or feel like worse versions of another animal. For example, why use Plesiosaurus when you could use Attenborosaurus? Why use Elasmosaurus when Styxosaurus is better? And furthermore, there are again some very famous animals like the Basilosaurus missing from the roster. Of course, one of the great shames in this game is that the aquatic animals were badly let down by the terrible implementation of the Lagoon system as a whole, but more on that later. I want to also briefly touch on 2 specific groups of animals. JWE2 has brought us 2 new hybrids to add to the hybrids that Jurassic World Evolution 1 brought us. However, all but the Indorex and Indoraptor are DLC animals. The fact that we had to buy the original game's hybrids again is still in my eyes a bit of a cash grab. The other thing I want to discuss is the smattering of non-dinosaur and non-Mesozoic period animals, in the form of the Megalodon, Dimetrodon, Dunkleosteus and the Lystrosaurus. These 4 animals highlight a crucial area of expansion that the next game really should consider. Expanding the animal roster beyond primarily the Cretaceous period would really improve the game's animal variation moving forwards. It remains a shame that we did not get other animals common with those 4, such as Dimetrodon's key prey item, Edaphosaurus. Now there is one final aspect to the roster that needs to be discussed throughout this section, because it affects all aspects of the animals in this game amongst all of the groups. It affects 12 of the game's animals. Not a huge number, but it is something I want to include here because a lot of those 12 animals are DLC specific animals which people paid for, and that is the mix of very small creatures in the game. Animals like Microceratus, Compsognathus and Moros intrepidus. These animals are totally pointless. The fact is, the game's scale is just not suited to animals of such a tiny size, and they become totally lost in these massive natural style enclosures. So many of these tiny animals are included in DLCs, and the fact that they asked us to pay money for animals we can barely see due to the game lacking effective management options for them, more on this later, is a bit of a piss take in my view. So what can I say about the roster as a whole? Is it bloated? I don't think so, but I do think more needed to be done to give us a greater variation in some areas, as well as bringing in some of the more famous animals that we haven't had a chance to see yet. The persistent ignoring of Plateosaurus in both this and the first game makes so little sense to me, given it's a keystone animal of the Triassic. Now, while some animals can look on the whole very similar to others, there is a way that they can be saved, and that is with their appearance, animations, and skins.
If their genetic code was pure, many of them would look quite different, but you didn't ask for reality, you asked for more teeth.
I never asked for a monster!
So, appearance. And what I am talking about here is the basic model and look of the animals, as well as their posture. Let's take a start with the terrestrial animals, and let's start with what's good. Something that JWE2 really has evolved in is its use of feathers for some keystone species to make them stand out amongst the rest of our dinosaur cast. While these feathered animals are primarily included in DLC content, the addition of more species with feathers helps to give Jurassic World Evolution 2 a slightly more modern, more scientific look. Again, as I said earlier, I think it's odd we don't have some of the species in the game that have actual physical evidence of feathers, such as the Archaeopteryx or Ornithomimus, but it's still progress. Many of these feathered species that are in the game, however, have been very well modelled and well made, with glorious skins that I'll talk about more in a little bit. Another aspect of the models, of the terrestrial animals especially, is the addition of model variants. These represent the subtle differences in model design for some movie animals. For example, the chunkier Jurassic Park 3 Brachiosaurus. Instead of just adding them as skins, updates change these to new models, allowing us to use the new skin system on them. New model variations let us create more varied herds, and can create a sense of sexual dimorphism. This is all good for gameplay, even if it is driven by our imagination. But hey, creativity is the name of the game when it comes to simulation and park builders, so I don't consider that a negative. Beyond those specific elements, the game's model quality is like Jurassic World Evolution 1, very good still with its terrestrial animals, with all of them getting a next game makeover in skin resolution and texture, making even the returning animals look better. And special mention has to be made here to the Ankylodocus, whose redesigned model looks far better than the first games. However, it's not all fantastic for the terrestrial animals. My first criticism here is that some animals remain slightly spoiled by their film's representations. Baryonyx and Pyroraptor stand out here, as they are very ugly versions of these animals, but unfortunately that cannot be helped thanks to the movies. The Dimetrodon is equally naff, and of course we still have the very old-fashioned Jurassic Park 3 Spinosaurus. It's a shame we did not get a more accurate depiction as an alternative model. What is also a shame is that the grow-up that occurred to Ankylodocus did not occur to the Dreadnoughtus or the Frontier Giga, or the Frontier Stegosaurus, or the Frontier Triceratops, or the Frontier Uranosaurus, or the still very controversial depiction of the Deinonychus. However, it is in the area of posture where Jurassic World Evolution 2's terrestrial animals are let down the most. Too many of these animals maintain very old-fashioned postures. Not every animal is like this. The raptors have their stiff, straight tails, and the posture of animals like the Triceratops is a lot better than, say, Dinosaur with Stephen Fry, but not all of them are so good. For example, almost all of the hadrosaurs walk entirely on two legs, practically dragging their tails around. It's generally accepted that animals like Parasaurolophus were, when adult, primarily walking around on four legs, and only running on two when it was absolutely necessary. Added to this are animals like the Acrocanthosaurus and Pachycephalosaurus, whose postures are far too upright, and again have a very old-fashioned tail-dragging posture, especially when standing. Another area of annoyance is the dominance of hyper-droopy tails on animals like the Dryosaurus and Homalocephali, which is again against the generally accepted theory that most bipedal dinosaurs kept their tails stiff behind them as a counterweight. While this may come off as nitpicking, it seems odd to me that they would bring in feathered animals to be more current to the science, while keeping dinosaur postures from the 1970s. Moving on to pterosaurs, most of the animals are modelled very nicely. Of course, the Quetzalcoatlus and the Pteranodon suffer from their Jurassic World depictions. The Pteranodon especially was only saved when the Jurassic Park 3 model was made a full variant, totally annihilating the base game's crestless, ugly version. Of special mention is the Yehalopterus, the impossibly cute feathered pterosaur, and the wonderful Thanatos Dracon, bringing in a correctly sized Asdarkid to the game. Generally, the pterosaurs are modelled accurately to the fossils, and when sitting have the correct posture. The biggest issue with the pterosaurs is the dominance of fish being their primary diet, regardless of many pterosaurs having much more varied diets, or not eating fish at all. Again, with the aquatics, most are modelled in line with the current science, which is good, with the only one really suffering being the super oversized Mosasaurus. Of course, there are two controversial animals to talk about here, the Liopleurodon and the Elasmosaurus. Both of these animals suffer from what I'm going to call the dragon effect, as both of these animals, more heavily on the Liopleurodon, have excessive additions of spikes and horns. The Liopleurodon has so many of these that it makes it look more like a crocodile. Now, on the one hand, I can understand why it's been done. Make the Liopleurodon and the Elasmosaurus look correct, and they'll just look very similar to the other animals already in the game. It's a similar issue that results in the Deinonychus basilisk frill. However, I think that there were other ways of adding interest to these animals beyond hydrodynamically damaging horns and spikes. For example, adding luck skins, unique animations, or adding elements that at least make sense for the animal given its habitat. And given that Frontier must have known the fanbase love of the Liopleurodon thanks to Walking with Dinosaurs, the fact they created a awful rendition of the animal sucks. Of course, this doesn't take anything away from the amazing Dunk, or the Meg, or the wonderfully cute Plesiosaurus. Overall, I think most of the animals in this game do, at least on the face of it, look great. Yes, there are some issues with some animals, but generally they do a good job of creating the animals physically. So next up comes the difficult bit, making them live.
Who did I find it most difficult to work with? Animators. Definitely animators. You know, chase this dinosaur, chase that dinosaur. You'd swear we couldn't act.
So this bit is going to be tricky to talk about given the huge number of animals that we have to look at. So I'm going to break this down into looking at basic animations, social animations, and combat hunting animations. And I'm going to talk about the pterosaurs first, since they're the easiest to discuss. The pterosaurs are unfortunately Jurassic World Evolution 2's forgotten child when it comes to animation quality. Part of this comes down to the limited behaviours they demonstrate, very much like how the dinosaurs were on day 1 in Jurassic World Evolution 1. The pterosaurs do very little else other than move about and eat. And even here we have some oddities. This may come across as a nitpick, but they flap way too much for animals that were designed to glide over long distances. And worse still, they have no walking animation, which means they fly everywhere, even if the distance is short. Not walking also removes options for unique behaviours, which is another area that the pterosaurs lack. We have no social animations for these animals at all, beyond the occasional animation for them to move about on the feeders. This makes the animals feel very robotic. They are, in my eyes, a step backwards in quality. That being said, the animations of them hunting prey or attacking the choppers is pretty cool, so at least they have that. Next, let's look at the aquatics. Unlike the pterosaurs, the aquatics actually got some updates to their animations to to improve them and make them more alive, certainly welcome after the limited way they launched on day one. First to come were a number of animations for them attacking the lagoons when unhappy, which was certainly nicer than just having them starve. While most of these animations were just body impacts, it was better than nothing. They move very nicely, and unlike some of the dinosaurs that I care to mention, all of the aquatic animals feel like they move and swim with weight. In terms of social animations, these were added a lot later on in the game's development. Some of these animations are very good, making use of the animals' unique body shapes as an inspiration. For example, the Liopleurodon using its flippers to slap and roll against one another, and the Plesiosaurus and Attenborosaurus performing cute nose bumps. Others, like the Nothosaurus, have clearly been based on real-life animals, in their case otters. However, other animals have been left with a fairly boring roll around the other one animation, which is pretty dull and shows little imagination. I find it surprising how few of the animals in the lagoons make use of real-life inspiration for social animations or idle animation. No whale-like flipper or tail splashes on the surface, for example. What also stands out amongst the lagoon animals is that many show limitations in terms of the 3D space that water provides. They tend to swim on flat plains going up and down. This is disappointing given they have the ability to have verticality in movement, rolling and going directly upwards and downwards. The only time this is shown is in the special animations for the shark feeders. The animations are impressive, especially the air jaw style Megalodon one, and again help to give these species a unique attitude. There is, however, a general flaw with them, which is a flaw all animal animations have that I'll get to at the end. Now then, the terrestrial animals. Just in effort of not creating a 10-hour long video looking at every specific animal, I won't be talking about every single species here, but I will highlight some specifics. In terms of basic movement, the animals do maintain their Jurassic World Evolution 1 quality, walking, running and laying down to rest or sleep. Some changes have been made to how some animals move, with the Ankylosaurs having less of a gallopy gait, and the sauropods moving a little slower, making their basic movement feel more realistic. However, much like Jurassic World Evolution 1, the large theropods, especially T-Rex and Acrocanthosaurus, have a very odd front-heavy run animation that does not look realistic. Social and idle animations are amongst the newest things that came to the dinosaurs and other terrestrial animals in JWE2. No longer will we have animals standing in demon summoning circles. There are some very standout animations here amongst all the species we have. There are some very funny ones, like the Nisutoceratops biting another's horns, the Dinocaris getting stuck under the tail, and the Nodosaurus kicking another in the face. Stegosaurus has a nice idle animation where it rolls around. However, there are some issues amongst all of this. Many of the Ceratopsians share the same animation, barging into each other's thrills. Some socials are just very plain and boring. What also doesn't help is the fact that so many animals have the same head-scratching animation on the ground. Another aspect that remains not so good about the dinosaur social animations is the fact that they are just as predictable as always. In the pre-release period, we were told that the animations would be more dynamic, but the social ones really aren't. Animals deliberately wait in place for the other animal to arrive before suddenly doing the social and then walking off. You can always tell a social animation is about to play out, and that just doesn't look dynamic or interesting. Combat animations are equally problematic. While interspecies combat between herbivores now occurs, animals still tend to circle each other much in the same way as they did in Jurassic World Evolution 1, which just looks ridiculous. The much hyped pack hunting from animals like Velociraptor looks even more preposterous, especially on animals like the sauropods. Herbivores also do very little to fight back, unless they have obvious weapons, which is a serious flaw with the sauropods especially. There There are some interesting ones, like the Carnotaurus headbutting goats to kill them, but most carnivores share the same sort of animations. Either they bite it, lift it and swallow it whole, or leap on it from behind and kill it. There is a lot of copy-pasting going on, especially in the carnivore versus carnivore combat, where you will see some pretty repetitive animations. And this brings us to the biggest issue with the animation quality amongst all the animals in this game. There just isn't enough behavioural animations for each animal. Watch any enclosure for long enough and you will see the same animation played out over and over again. You will see animals sleeping in exactly the same way. You will see the same socials, the same idols constantly. There is also mostly a lack of environmental interaction. Pterosaurs will at least land on things and rest, but for the most part, animals don't care about the objects around them. Lagoon animals are not curious about the glass on the viewing galleries. The terrestrial animals don't climb the rocks or interact with the fallen logs. There just isn't enough to what they do, and the result is that they create a very one-dimensional animal. Don't get me wrong, the presence of social animations for the terrestrial and lagoon animals at least is a definite improvement over the animals of Jurassic World Evolution 1, however there is still more that could have been done to give more animals unique animations for them rather than copy and paste animations across. There is, for example, nothing as fun and imaginative as the Carnotaurus dance from Prehistoric Planet, or the Stegosaurus plate flushing from Walking with Dinosaurs. A greater range of possible animations for each animal would help reduce the over-display of animations that they do have, and help them make the animals feel alive. Now, once you have the animals, the next part is how they're managed, displayed, and customized.
She had them all attacking the fences when the feeders came.
The fences are electrified though, right?
That's right, but they never attacked the same place twice. They were testing the fences for weaknesses systematically. They remember.
So let's look at the animal customization, since it's probably the easiest part of this to tackle. Jurassic World Evolution 2 introduced the new skin system. I want to talk about this more in the next chapter, but what I would generally say is the much wider range of colours for the main body and patterns goes a long way to breathe new life into our animals, especially those returning from the first game. Improvements have also been made to some of the worst offenders from the first game, like the Velociraptor, that finally has some nice skins. Many of the new animals too, like the Amargasaurus and the Novosaurus, have superb skins and patterns. On top of the new 12x7 skin system is the addition of more model variants and canon skins, which again helps to really elevate a number of animals such as the T-Rex, the Kentrosaurus and more. There are some negatives which I'll talk about in the next chapter in more detail, but taking the whole thing as a whole, the skin and model variation system really helps to improve how we can customize the animals. There are of course missing elements to this, such as a total lack of size variation or younger animals, but overall it's a pretty good part of JWE2. So what about giving them somewhere to live? I will talk about the lagoons and aviaries in the next chapter directly, so let's talk about the terrestrial animals. Enclosure design has not radically altered that much. However, there are some quality of life improvements. Firstly, fencing now clearly indicates a security rating, and this directly relates to the security rating of the animal. As long as you use a fence with a stronger rating, you will stop breakouts. One small nitpick negative for me at least is that the electric fences still don't function like electric fences, in the fact that they don't shock the animal and drive them away, which is how they work in real life, but just function as a damage reduction, as they did in Jurassic World Evolution 1. One rather large change to at least housing herbivores is the addition of the paleobotany system. I spoke about this in previous chapters. The system replaced the feeders that Jurassic World Evolution 1 used, instead providing us with a range of vegetation types that will provide particular types of vegetation. For example, fruits, nuts, or fibre. Herbivores have various preferences of food, and you have to provide this in their enclosures. It is a better system than Jurassic World Evolution 1's, that's for sure, removing some of the micromanagement about refilling plant feeders. However, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes the system ends up in creating enclosures that are so jam-packed with vegetation that you end up with very messy looking enclosures. For small animals, this can be especially annoying, as small animals will completely disappear into plants. Carnivores, rather unfortunately, see no improvements to their feeding system, with only the standard meat and goat feeders available for most of them, along with the same Jurassic World Evolution 1 fish feeder for the piscivores. It is a great shame that not more effort was put into representing greater, more variable diets for the animals in the game. We end up with the stupidity of the insect feeder, used only for one aviary species, when it could have easily been added as a feeder for the ornithomimids or smaller carnivores like compies. Herbivores too ended up with nothing special to feed them, thanks to the removal of the paleobotany system. One positive thing, at least in terms of enclosure design, which I have previously mentioned, is the much better animal needs system that permits enclosures that are not 100% perfect. But beyond that, enclosure design remains fairly standard. Displaying animals also remains rather stubbornly unchanged in many ways. Viewing galleries and towers are still here from the first game, merely rebalanced in size. We do have a greater range of artistic design for them, which is at least something. We also have the same tour rides from the first game, with no real changes made to them. 3 updates did bring in the viewing domes, viewing log and the zipline. The viewing log and dome at least provide some internal enclosure viewing for the animal, a feature Jurassic Park Operation Genesis had, and which was finally introduced to the game. I personally think it's a shame that we have only one design of dome and log, but that's just me being picky again. What is, however, very apparent is the total lack of any water-based tour rides and any viewing from paths or benches. It means that again we are rather limited in how we can display our animals, having to rely on the static viewing cones for visibility. Oh, and while we're talking about that, did they make the viewing towers worse from the first game? Now instead of a long cone stretching out from the tower, you receive a circle at a set distance from the structure. How does that make sense? Frontier, stop breaking things. That being said, the addition of the domes and such is at least something more than nothing. And they do add some new options for the parks, along with the tour rides functioning as transport now, which provides new ways of building. But by far the biggest viewing related issue comes back to those small animals I mentioned several paragraphs ago. None of the viewing structures are really designed for animals that are small, where it makes no sense to me to have this enormous double-story viewing gallery for an animal that doesn't even come up beyond the gallery's safety bar at the bottom. It just doesn't make sense. Even those enormous fences look a little excessive for something as small as Morus intrepidus. Now, all animals need good care to keep them alive, and the same goes to ours. That is where the rangers, the ACU teams and the vets come in. Rangers in the second game function very much like the first. They are responsible for refilling the feeders, repairing damaged structures and taking photos. However, unlike the first game, the rangers have less functionality. In yet another example of Frontier breaking something that was totally fine, rangers now can't tranquilize animals and don't assist with medical needs. Rangers are, however, vital to your parks. All animals must now be regularly scanned by rangers to check nothing is wrong, and they can be automated to do this by attaching them to ranger posts. While the automation certainly works better now than it ever did on day one, sometimes rangers can still be rather stupid if you ask them to commit to another general task, but they will still at least refill feeders in their area, removing one of the most tedious elements of micromanagement. Just a shame they won't automatically repair damage as well, or patrol one enclosure at a time. One thing rangers did have added was the new muster ability, essentially a feature stolen from Jurassic Park Operation Genesis. It allows you to direct and herd animal groups together to move them to a location of your choice. It's an interesting feature with Jurassic Park Operation Genesis using it in various ways, so naturally Jurassic World Evolution 2 does very little with it beyond the use in DLC campaigns. The role of the ACU teams have not changed dramatically since the first game either. However, they are now the only people that can put dinosaurs out, but they can at least take photographs now. They have no part in dinosaur medical needs, as this is solely carried out by the vets. And finally we have the vets. Now I want to talk more about them in the next chapter, but on the whole I agree with the theory that paleo vets do bring new management needs to the game, and that's a good thing. The implementation of it, however, is a problem, which I will talk about in the next chapter. But again, being able to attach the vets to those ranger posts to automatically handle minor dinosaur medical needs is a huge improvement over the day one experience, where constant medical emergencies needed a lot of tedious management. I especially love the Star Trek style tricorders that they use on the vets to scan the animals.
An extinct animal that's brought back to life has no rights. It exists because we made it. We patented it. We own it.
So at the end of this mighty chapter on the animals of Jurassic World Evolution 2, what can I say? Well, there are positives to be found in here. The wide range of animals and new additions like the Aquatics and Aviaries help to add further interest to a game whose terrestrial roster is, it cannot be denied, primarily copy and pasted from the first game. There are also other improvements, such as the attempt to create a more varied skin system, and the attempt to add better management of them when it's within the enclosures or whether it's with the new vet system. However, the true mark of a game about looking after animals should be that we see these animals as more than just empty husks. Obviously they're not real, but the animals should be doing everything they can to avoid making us realize that. It was one of the biggest flaws with the first game, that in terms of behavior the animals did very little. While there have been improvements and that shouldn't be ignored, there's also a lot of shortcomings. Lots of copy-paste animations, too few behaviors, and still some very strange oddities like moonwalking animals. And it also has to be said that the total lack of animations for the aviary animals is a very significant flaw. Overall, I think that while there were some steps forward, I think more could have been done, and unfortunately the repetition of errors from the first game all adds more weight to the argument that Jurassic World Evolution 2 is not enough of a step change from the first game. But there is the very bare bones of something that could be great here, if, and I stress if, they develop the various areas in the next title. So in this chapter, I want to look specifically at the key new elements that Jurassic World Evolution 2 brought to the game in detail. These include things like the Lagoons, Aviaries, and expanded customization features. But we start first with the one key addition I think no one will mind if I call it, well, Ian?
That is one big pile of shit.
Are these characters erotica?
No. We have no animatronics here. No. Those people are the real miracle workers of Jurassic World.
So the scientist system. Ugh, where do we even begin with this? I've made previous videos on this system. It was flawed on day one. It was lamented and hated by players then, and it remains just as bad now. The system was obviously designed to directly combat one of the major criticisms of the first game, being the serious lack of management in a game calling itself a park management game. The idea was that now we had to manage this staff type as we constructed our parks and facilities. On the face of it, it's a good idea. It was just in the implementation where it went very, very badly. In fact, I can't think of something being implemented in a worse way. Perhaps this.
Olaf the Hairy, High Chief of all the Vikings, accidentally ordered 80,000 battle helmets with the horns on the inside.
Blackadder aside, seriously though, the way that this system was implemented is screwed up in so many ways. And the first way is that it basically totally screws up resource management for the player. Let me explain. Most games fundamentally include some sort of resource management for the player. For example, in Subnautica, players have to manage their health, oxygen, food, and water to survive. In first-person shooters, you have to manage your health, armor, and ammunition. In city builders, you have to manage your utility, your water and power supplies, as well as population and economy. Take your favorite game, and I bet there's some form or multiple forms of resource management tied to it. Jurassic World Evolution 1 even had it. In JWE 1, we had multiple resources. Income was our primary one, which we did have some small element of control over by altering prices in the amenities. We also had to manage our park's power supply. Our dinosaur dig teams were another resource, as were our separate research teams. Jurassic World Evolution 2's problem is that it totally ruins the resource management for the player. Yes, we still have power to manage, and yes, we still have income to manage, albeit with zero ways of affecting it, but it is the rest of the game where the scientist system tanks the resource management. Like I said in my original scientist criticism video, the main problem is the hyperfixation on a singular staff type that is then directly added to almost every single function the park has. Our scientists are required to research new things for the park, cure dinosaurs of injuries, genetically create genomes, grow dinosaurs to maturity, go and dig fossils up, gather DNA from those fossils, and capture wild dinosaurs. Now add to this system the fact that you're limited in how many scientists you can have, and imminently the system becomes an instant bottleneck in your game. So often when replaying campaign or challenge modes, I found my progress delayed because my scientists were busy elsewhere. The system creates flow-breaking stoppages and annoyances because it's simply too bloody shallow. It results in players always being in resource deficit during gameplay, as your scientists are always usually busy at the exact moment you actually want to use them. Moreover, they provided this stress system in the game so that if you use the same scientists more than a few times, you have to send them on a rest period that costs money. Now, I understand that perhaps overworking a member of staff should come with a consequence, but the thing is, they get stressed even if you don't overwork them, and more still, they don't lose stress naturally if you don't use them for a while. So again, the system is very shallow and works to actively delay and stop the players progressing, not adding any sort of interesting management. On top of that, I don't know how many vets who can also go and dig up dinosaurs. I don't know many engineers who could create a fully stable DNA sequence. The idea that a single staff type can do all of this is not only unrealistic, but it directly flies in the face of the first game with its multiple staff types, and flies in the face of Frontier's own Planet games, which have a multitude of staff types in them. It feels like Frontier was scared of creating deeper management experiences for their management game, and resulted in creating an oversimplified, shallow experience that actively harms the thing they were going for. And this system also goes in hand with many other elements, causing further carnage, like the vets, which I'll be discussing shortly. The game's tech tree equally has a hand in causing flow-breaking management, which I'm including here, as it's an area where your scientists are most necessary. You see, in the first game, your tech tree was a non-linear system. You were free to conduct research in whatever order and way you liked, choosing what to research and when. This gave players control over what we wanted and gave us the ability to prepare for things like researching medical cures in advance. The second game completely throws this away again for a more simple linear tech tree. You just research things in a straight line. Not only does this remove a degree of control for the players over how we want to conduct the research, but it also leads to some very weird results. One thing I would say about the tech tree is that it is nice that we can research a single element and unlock multiple things. That is the only positive of this system I have. One of the weird issues with the tech tree is that there are multiple elements where the research system becomes purely reactionary instead of preparatory. Let me explain what I mean. In Jurassic Park Operation Genesis, you could research the cure for rabies at any point. You could also research the hatchery immunization at any point. This meant if you managed your research properly, you could prepare for any possible outbreaks in advance, or you could risk it and focus on a different area. A perfect example of risk-reward management. In Jurassic World Evolution 2, you can't research the cure to rabies until one of your animals has caught rabies, which you can only learn once a vet has scanned the animal. Then you have to manually go and take a photo of the dinosaur with a ranger team, because apparently our vet saying it has rabies isn't enough evidence. Then you have to get your scientists to research the cure, assuming that they're available, and then you have to heal the problem, by which time your rabies infested animal has probably infected others, or broken out the enclosure it was in, or has died. You know what I say to that? No! There's other examples in the medical system requiring players to physically wait until an animal is sick to research the cure for it. What makes no sense is that most of the illnesses are real-world issues that are currently already known about. It's not like we're having to cure COVID 40k edition or something, so why can't we just research those cures in advance and prepare for problems? There's other oddities in the tech tree, like some dinosaur unlocks being in weird places. You'll get Velociraptors before Compsognathus. You'll unlock Megalosaurus with T-Rex in the Jurassic Park Chaos Theory. How does that make sense? Surely the more dangerous animals should be at the end, with the smaller, easier animals at the start. Clearly that's too logical for Frontier. Or how you're unable to research and build the goat feeder or the piscivore feeder until after you've already made one and have it in the park. How does that make any sense? That you have to basically starve your animal before you can feed it? And why is the addition of another Jeep for our ACU buildings a final tier upgrade? This tech tree just feels like it's been designed by an AI bot. It's full of very bizarre choices. And of course, that's even if you can research the thing you want, because your scientists might be more busy healing a dinosaur, or digging up fossils, or growing a dinosaur egg patch, or gathering DNA, or on a bloody holiday that we've had to pay for. So again, you're stuck waiting for your scientists to be free to conduct any research. It just leads to downtime where you're stuck not doing anything because you physically can't without these godlike scientists. The scientist system earns the hatred it has from the community, but my fear here is that Frontier sees the whole system as a dead end and removes it entirely because of that backlash. That is not what I want. Irrespective of my hatred for the system, I think it's a step towards the right path. As much as people hate being reminded of this fact, Jurassic World Evolution is a park management game. It's not a dinosaur combat simulator or a Site B simulator. It's a game about management, and that management should be there for folks who want a management experience as well as cool animals. I really hope Frontier takes some advice. Psst, Frontier, I have a video that might help. Feel free to copy it, and works on the system more in the next game. But alas, as JWE2 goes, this edition was a dismal failure. Time to take a dip into Hell's aquariums. The addition of the lagoons was one feature of the game I was most hyped for during development. Many of my favourite prehistoric animals are aquatic animals. Liopleurodon's introduction in Walking with Dinosaurs burned that animal into my brain, and throughout my time with the game, I've tackled the lagoons a lot in various videos. I also think I'm the one park builder that I've seen on YouTube at least who uses the lagoons a lot in parks. I don't think I've made a sandbox park without a lagoon, so I consider myself well placed to discuss the addition. Let's start with the animals themselves. I've already discussed some aspects of the lagoon creatures in previous chapters, but there are some extra things to say. Like I said, the roster is decent enough, having a more varied range of shape and time period than other aspects of the game. This is a good thing. What is also good is that most of the animals look fantastic. However, much like the terrestrial animals that I was talking about in the previous chapter, the animals themselves fall down in the animation and behavior department, bumping its head on that mechanical ceiling Best in Slot mentioned. While it was good that the lagoon animals got behaviors added into the game through free updates, the animals still don't have a great range of behaviors on show. They are very confined to the lagoon water, so we have no breaching animations or behaviors where animals use flippers or tails deliberately on the surface. Many of the social animations are far too similar, merely minor variations on swimming close, or this half-assed swim around thing that many of them do. We also don't have other theoretical behaviours like sifting silt for gastroliths or interacting with objects within the lagoons as idle animations. They also don't interact with the guest viewing galleries. A symptom that is actually common with all the animals is that they show no interest in the humans. Any trip to a zoo will highlight many animals will respond to nearby people. We also have no interspecies animations beyond the very simplistic kill animations. The only animals to get anything close to unique animations are the species capable of shark leaping, with each animal having their own version. Of course, once you've seen the animals doing this leap in exactly the same way every time, it quickly becomes repetitive and dull. As a result, this makes the lagoon animals feel as shallow and soulless as the animals in Jurassic World Evolution 1 used to feel, and I think this has resulted in some folks considering the animals boring. The animals are also let down by their habitats, so let's talk about how the lagoons actually work as homes. Lagoon construction follows a modular system, with circular shaped lagoon pieces that can be snapped together to create larger pools, as opposed to a freeform system that games like Zoo Tycoon 2 utilised. While this does limit the shapes we can create for the lagoons, I personally don't find anything wrong with the system, since we can still create a wide variety of shapes with this method. Everything else for the lagoons, from the viewing galleries to the decorative pieces, then snaps to predetermined snapping points on the sides of the lagoons. It's a very easy, simple system, designed to be fairly fast to use, which was probably done by Frontier to make it easier for players to use the lagoons in the first place. However, while easy to use, the lagoons rather ironically are a fairly shallow habitat. Even though numerous free updates and paid DLCs added lots of extra decorative aspects to the lagoons, they are still woefully underdeveloped in terms of customization and application. Decorative pieces can be snapped to the outside, yes, but they are fairly small and don't really disguise the ugliness of these large concrete pools. Decorations are also fairly limited in what they offer, with no DFW facility-like pieces, no Biosyn pieces, no Malta pieces, and only a few Jurassic Park pieces. The decorative bits we did get feel like they haven't really been designed with a purpose. For example, these sail-like decorations. What exactly are they designed to look like? Art is, I know, subjective, but what about these random sails says lagoon full of prehistoric animals. The flags are fine, but why are they limited to only the mosasaur? It gets worse when we consider what we can do with the insides of the lagoons. Yes, we have a range of decorative pieces like corals and rocks and bubble generating cracks and small sunken boats, and I do appreciate the addition of the bubble making decoration and volcanic vendors decorations that add some movement, something vastly missing from a lot of decorative aspects in this game. But all of these internal pieces share the same problem. Not only are they almost painfully generic, but they are far too small for the sheer size and depth of the lagoons. None of the internal decorative pieces take advantage of the size or depth to create more three-dimensional structures. The small size means you have to place down so many to create a reasonable display, and it still results in a very flat looking lagoon. The only decorations to actually try to get away from this is the kelp patches we got. We badly needed some larger, more elaborate structures, arches, caves, sunken boats, anything to make the lagoons more interesting. What's more is that we have no objects to decorate the surface, apart from that ghastly, ugly rock island they added in the DLC. We have no objects that float on the surface at all, and the reason why is that, well, the water inside these lagoons isn't actually water. It's a texture effect. Unlike Zoo Tycoon, a much older game whose water had buoyancy, or Planet Zoo where water is actually water, in Jurassic World Evolution 2 the water is just a texture effect. You can see how it works if you build a lagoon viewing gallery on land. You can see that it adds a murky blue filter to the glass. And sometimes if you use NVIDIA Ansel's screenshotting system, you can clip out of the viewing gallery and see that the surface layer of the lagoon is just a texture effect and that inside there's nothing. Technically, our aquatic creatures aren't swimming, they're flying like pterosaurs. A very lazy way if you look at games like Planet Zoo or Zoo Tycoon 2. And compounding those problems is that the lagoons themselves cannot be customized in any way. We can't change the depth of the water, we can't change the color of the water, we can't add roofs, we can't change the color of the concrete or add alternative materials to the outsides, we can't change what the lagoon floor looks like or alter the shape of it, nor do we have that many feeding options for our animals, just fish and sharks. No squid or jellyfish that would have been on the menu for ichthyosaurs or archelon. Just a quick example. We also have the issue that lagoons have very little connectivity to the parks. We're not able to create forest, vegetation or landmass too close to them. We can place viewing galleries on the outside, or we can have a dome on the inside, but that's it. No tunnels or glass window sections, no submarine tours, just the gallery and the dome. All this results in lagoons never really integrating that well with the parks. They end up standing out as these ugly concrete blocks with animals that don't really do very much. And what doesn't help is that the lagoons themselves don't really add anything to the management side of the game. Beyond having to research them and refill the feeders or send vets out occasionally, the lagoons don't introduce unique management aspects. For example, we don't have to worry about filtering the water to maintain its cleanliness. Our galleries can't spring leaks or have animals break the glass. Animals can't get beached on the rock needing rescue. The lagoons themselves can't really be heavily damaged, nor can they freeze in the wintry maps. There are so many possibilities of gameplay management additions that lagoons could bring, but again, Frontier did none of it. It's so frustrating as someone who adores a lot of the aquatic animals this game brought in to see a system that could have been really something and really interesting treated in such a shallow way. The system had so much potential on day one, but beyond some decorations, Frontier never tackled the basic problems with the lagoons, regardless of how much we told them what the issues were. Like the scientist system, the lagoons were implemented in such a bad way that it's no surprise that a lot of players seem to barely use them. As a member of my Discord, Potato Man states, they were passable, but they leave a lot to be desired. He specifically mentioned the difficulty decorating them as a serious issue, stating that he finds decorating lagoons a chore. Placing each individual piece of coral is a bore, as their small sizes means you have to place down loads and loads of pieces to make them look appealing, which doesn't help with the game's poor performance and the tedious nature of the camera constantly zipping in and out of the lagoon. While I don't consider this feature a total failure, it certainly could have been better.
Oh my god.
What is it?
It's a bird cage.
For what?
So from the depths to the skies, let's look at the Aviaries, another of Jurassic World Evolution 2's habitat additions that was very hyped prior to the game's launch. It is worth remembering that an aviary structure was in the original game thanks to the Return to Jurassic Park DLC, but it was limited in functionality and species. So let's start with the animals. Again, much like the lagoon animals, there are positives and negatives here. A generally nice range of animals in terms of size and shape, with a few less great options. I have spoken in the previous chapter about this, so I'll move on quickly. The issue with the pterosaurs in this game is that much like the other animal groups, the quality of the animals' animations is seriously lacking. In fact, it is the pterosaurs that feel the most underdeveloped of all animal groups. Their animation sets are ridiculously limited, with no walking or social animations, and most share the same idle preening animation too. They also flap way too much when flying, which looks very unnatural for animals that were so well designed for gliding. It makes them feel very bland, with very little to watch or look out for. A total lack of social animation is probably the worst part of this, since it means animals don't really interact with one another. This was a day one issue never addressed. That being said, the wide range of species, shape and colour that many of these animals bring to the game does again help make Jurassic World Evolution 2 better than its previous title. Much like the Lagoons, Aviaries are built in a modular fashion with circular main elements and snappable pieces. However, unlike the Lagoons, the Aviaries make a far better job of integrating to the park and have far more customization. The first aspect of this customization is the design of the Aviaries themselves. Thanks to the range of building sets we have, which I'll be talking more about shortly, each of the aviary dome types, from its Jurassic World glass houses to the Jurassic Park netting and the rusty Malta style girders, has its own feel to it. Then you have the viewing galleries, all of which look very different to one another, which further helps to add customization to the aviaries. On top of that, the aviaries are part of the general park building. This means that you can model the insides of them much the same way as the standard fenced enclosures, with rocks, vegetation and decorative elements. And what's more, you can have any tour vehicles pass inside the aviaries, so they even have a workable tour system to go alongside the domes and the galleries we can place. This is all pretty positive stuff. On the other side of the electric fence, some things are less good. The aviaries themselves do not have that many pieces that are specifically for the pterosaurs. In fact, we have exactly 2 pieces. 2 very boring, very bland, concrete and metal roosting towers. They are so fucking ugly and so such limited effort. What was wrong with trying to make something that looks more like Jurassic Park, or more natural, or just anything better than this ugly monstrosity? And that's it. We have no real other specialist decorative pieces for the pterosaurs to interact with. Even in terms of diet and feeders, they all mostly eat fish. The only one who doesn't was the Halopterus that got its own insect feeder, a great new addition that was barely used at all. Talk about a waste. While pterosaurs can rest on any objects you place inside the aviaries, it feels like an opportunity was missed for some specific objects that were special for for the pterosaurs. Frontier surely could have used their imagination for some interesting ideas. We see the same lack of imagination in the aviary viewing galleries, which are surprisingly grounded for a viewing gallery meant to provide views of animals that fly. There are basically no objects for the aviary that take advantage of its height, in addition to lagoon pieces not taking advantage of its depth. As Spock might say,
this pattern indicates two-dimensional thinking.
And that is a very good point, Spock. It really does show them not really taking advantage of these three-dimensional spaces that they've created with the domes and the lagoons. In implementation, the aviaries are also bad in terms of bugs. The aviaries had several bugs on day one that made them very annoying to use. Pterosaurs would phase through the domes and escape. Pterosaurs would often get stuck and starve themselves to death. Both of these bugs still remain in the game. In fact, during my replay of the Oregon campaign and the DLC Malta campaign, I got to watch my pterosaurs be brought to the hatchery building, dropped inside, whereupon the pterosaur would magically phase through the building like the ghosts of Mesozoic past and escape. Perhaps I should have called the Ghostbusters? The persistence of these two bugs make them very tiresome additions to the game. It is only thanks to Kyodenic's Move It mod, where I can pick up an animal and move it around, that makes these bugs tolerable, since I can just move the stuck or escaped pterosaur. Having to tranquilize them and then move the animal to fix it, bugged stuck in mid-airness, was a pain in the neck. And the fact these bugs remain unfixed, no matter how many times Frontier would like to tell us in the patch notes the problem is fixed, is just not acceptable. As one of my Discord members, Lycaon, put it, the glitch of pterosaurs flying in place and starving to death is still a prevalent issue for me. And again, much like the lagoons, beyond researching them and having to do the basics of animal care, there's little the aviaries bring in terms of unique gameplay addition. While aviaries can be damaged by the animals or by storms leading to breakouts and guest deaths, there are no changes with how you look after the domes themselves. No regular maintenance needs or cleaning needs to be done. There's no climate control for the interiors. There's no purpose to the little drones that fly around on the insides besides working for the vets and rangers when more could have been done with them. There's no unique aviary viewing systems either. Our final discussion here is specifically the Quetzalcoatlus in the Malta DLC. This hugely oversized film version of this animal is just way too large for the current height that the domes go to, making the animal look preposterous inside them, not helped by the fact that they won't walk anywhere and just flap around super close to the ground. So much like the lagoons, the aviaries feel like an underdeveloped addition to the game. Along with the pterosaur animals themselves, they did bring something new and different, and something that could have been developed into a more interesting aspect of gameplay and park building. Unfortunately, much like the lagoons, Frontier never really took the time to develop them beyond what they were on day one, and beyond some minor additions, just sort of forgot about them. It remains another system that could have been far better. So, like the lagoons, not a failure, but could have been better with just a little more care, attention, and growth.
Park will open with the basic tour you're about to take, and then other rides will come online 6 or 12 months after that. Absolutely spectacular design, spared no expense.
So, one of Rich Newbold's key points in the list of the 4 he mentioned, and that I mentioned back in Chapter 1, was that Jurassic World Evolution 2 would have greater park creativity, driven by new tools. So let's check out all the ways Jurassic World Evolution 2 tried to make us more creative. Let's start with what I think is the best addition that Jurassic World Evolution 2 actually brought to the game, the amenity customization system. This system allows us to select various different options for how we'd like our amenities to look, changing what the general structure looks like, adding our own preferred colors, adding decorative elements to the roofs and to the ground around it. It even allows us to change where the building entrances are and the colors of the lighting. It is a fantastically well-designed system. Seriously, I'm not being sarcastic here. I think this system is a really good idea. The biggest shame for me is that a system like this was not added to more buildings so that we could actually implement a park-wide basic design aesthetic, but on the whole, allowing us to make the amenities look more unique and interesting around our parks, to theme them and theme areas, is a really great customization feature. Whoever came up with it, gold star. Please expand it in the next game. Next up, we have the animal skin system. Now, I've already touched on this, but I would like to go into some more detail here about various elements. Jurassic World Evolution 2 allows us to create up to 72 different skin variations for our animals by allowing us to pick from 12 primary base color palettes named after various ecosystems in the world, and then 6 colors for a preset pattern for each animal, or a blank pattern. This is a much more varied system than Jurassic World Evolution 1's 6 skins. It allows us to create a wide range of animal skins that adds all sorts of creativity to builds. We can create skin sets for set environments a lot easier, create female and male skins, create albino and melanistic skins, and more. This design is a significant improvement. There are, however, some downsides. There are some animals whose patterns and colours are simply beautiful, with the Utahraptor, Elasmosaurus, Acrocanthosaurus, Yeholopterus, and the Struthiomimus being amongst some of my favourites. However, there are many animals whose base skins and patterns are just really bad and result in boring, bland, or ugly combinations. Sauropods are hit especially bad here, with the Apatosaurus and Memenchisaurus being amongst this group with awful combinations. The default Allosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus patterns make these animals look like they're suffering from some sort of plague, which is pretty off-putting. Then you have animals like Styracosaurus, whose colours and frill decorations are just very lackluster. The Mosasaurus in the Lagoons suffers from awful skins as well, as does the Tylosaurus. Ankylosaurs are generally pretty poor skinned overall as well. It feels very strange that some animals can look absolutely beautiful and then some can look incredibly bland and ugly. It feels like there were two different teams working on the dinosaurs, with two very different ideas of what skins and patterns should look like. Another issue with the skin system for me is that we have no control over what the pattern is. The patterns are always identical. I would have preferred a system where we could choose between several different pattern types. Another annoyance with the skin system is that a lot of the time, the colours presented in the squares shown in the hatchery system have no correlation to the actual colour the animal ends up looking like, which makes the colour squares kind of pointless. For example, do you think this blue square on the baryonyx will make a blue dinosaur? No, it's green. Think this Camarasaurus will be a purple? Nope, that's red. This blue Carnotaurus is in fact sea green. A grey Dinocaris is actually mostly orange. How about adding a green pattern to this Herrera? Nope, actually that's a creamy yellow pattern. How about the purple and brown Kentro? Actually no, that's grey and red. One of the worst offenders is Nodosaurus, where the main colours cannot seem to decide what part of the animal, the body, or the armour they want to use to base the colour on. Hence this wonderful green and brown design for the blue square, and it only gets worse if you check the patterns out. The cyan square of Palophylax is in fact primarily green. The purple of Papurana is clearly brown and orange. The green of Pulcrana is very clearly the cyan blue of Pelophylax. The Lithobates green is actually grey and orange. Calcarana's black is in fact murky green and red, and Rana's orange is in fact brown and blue. It just makes the skin system a pain to use. But to finish on a good point, the expansion of the Lux skins to other animals is something I actually like. While it may be unrealistic to have some animals that can glow in the dark, I think it's an imaginative idea that can really help make some species pop. Overall, the skin system is definitely better than the first game, but there are some downsides to it. I'll say it's a 7 out of 10. Next up, we have the expansion on how many decorative pieces we now have for our parks. Decorations were one of Jurassic World Evolution 1's massive faults. It was good to see that Jurassic World Evolution 2 corrected the failure. It did take a few updates, but at least we got a huge range of vegetation and decorative objects to lay around our parks, with even a few special pieces coming with the DLCs. Everything from fountains to dinosaur statues, Jurassic Park gates and Jurassic World signage. There There is a lot for us to place down around our parks now, and it finally makes it feel like a park building game. It's not all praise. The decorations that we do have a few issues. Many of them are all based on the same general footprint. So we have many circular fountains, or many lozenge-shaped planters, for example. We are also missing some of the named dinosaur signs from the first game, and much like the Lagoon and Aviary pieces, there's not many decorations that come in a large size, nor have a lot of verticality to their makeup. So again, it can make the park seem a little flat. Also, a lot of decorations are purely static, with no moving elements. So again, the parks can feel a bit dead. We have benches, for example, but guests don't use them. Flags would be a good example of another non-static decoration. We also have no decorative elements that can be put under the grouping of environmental decoration. Things like waterfalls, mists and smoke generators, water splashes and fountain sprayers. These elements, especially waterfalls, are objects that the player base has been screaming for since day one. However, we remain without. And this also brings me to the environmental modification tools that remain stubbornly unchanged since the first game. However, don't mistake me here. I think the level of park customization here, helped by the new environmental biomes, is so much better than the first game. The huge wealth of parts and pieces that we have is a massive improvement, and it really does help make Jurassic World Evolution 2 feel like a fresh experience. Yes, there are things I can be critical of, especially when it comes to the decorations we have for the lagoons, for example, but in a broad sense, park customization is better. I would say that this is one aspect of the game that is very close to a complete success. Fuck it, I'll be nice, and I'll say it's a success.
As a matter of fact, I do have the dinosaur's best interests in mind of a paleo-veterinarian. That's a real thing.
The veterinary system is, like many other systems in this game, a good idea. Having to care for our animals' health in a more significant way beyond the first game's Rangers fire darts all good method does seem like a good way of adding more dinosaur management. After all, zoos and animal parks need good quality staff to ensure the long-term health of the animals. However, in implementation, the system comes out far too shallow and rather more tedious. Part 1 of the problem is the scientist system. As I spoke about earlier, the paleo-veterinary system is directly attached to the scientist system. This means that healing animals from serious injuries can often be delayed by having to wait for the scientist to be free. Now, to the game's credit, serious animal injuries are a lot rarer now than they ever were day one, and being able to attach medical vans to ranger posts to instantly handle issues they can handle was a good update. And it's nice that the dinosaur alpha challenge combat no longer can cause serious injury, but it can still be annoying to get animals healed up with the scientist system screwing it up. In addition, the paleo-veterinary system is, just like the text tree, purely reactionary. Yes, we can apply genetic improvements to the animals to make them more resistant to illness. However, that is the only way we can directly improve their health. There's no other ways of effectively improving or managing the health of our animals, which means the system doesn't really add management, it just adds a reactionary busy work task element because we as players have no impact on it. I also want to nitpick that the actual paleo vet building is really pretty boring in its design, and the idea that these dinosaurs are being magically healed by the spraying of some magic liquid on them is also pretty uninspired. It wouldn't have taken much to have a few scripted staff that appear and act out doing some surgery on the animal, but alas, robotic arms spraying magic goo is all we get. While most of the other issues with the system can be put under the category of nitpicks, it is this system's reliance on the scientist system that is its biggest problem. All that I can say about the system now is that it's less tedious than it used to be, but it still feels shallow and underdeveloped.
The voice you're now hearing is Richard Kiley. We spared no expense.
So in this section, I just wanted to quickly run through some other smaller additions that were added to this game. The new biomes, which I've already spoken about, were mostly a triumph of this game. Being able to construct parks in new locations around the world does a lot for the replayability of this game. This goes hand in hand with a wide range of maps, from the temperate forests of Germany to the sandy islands of the Mediterranean. The only criticism I have of the biomes is that the alpine and taiga biomes are way too similar to one another. Overall, I think the new biomes were a success, so take a point. The range of building sets is a feature that mostly comes out in the middle for me. While it's good that we have 5 building sets to play with, on PC at least, which provide a range of building styles from the Mayan-themed Jurassic Park to the utilitarian DFW, I am a little unhappy that 3 of the 5 building sets are purely aimed at facility parks. So, for more tourist-focused parks, we limited to just the Jurassic World set, most of which we saw in the first game, and the Jurassic Park set. It would have been nice to have an additional tourist-focused build set, as well as the other facility sets. Overall, I think the buildings are a 50-50 feature. Next, we have the guest types. Now, before the game released, this was a much hyped feature, where we're told all about the 4 main guest types: general guests, adventure guests, luxury guests, and nature guests. It's essentially a homage to JPOG's guest system, where particular guests would desire particular elements of your parks. The Jurassic World Evolution 2 system attempts to do the same thing, with particular guests liking different elements. For example, your luxury guests want hotels, and your adventure guests like tour rides. It sounds fine in theory, unfortunately it really doesn't transfer into any significant gameplay or management changes. After all of our guests use hotels, and all of our guests use the tours. It doesn't really affect the amenities in a significant degree, since we just pick the module that gives the most money, rather than picking the one based on the guests. Not to mention that without the Jurassic Park Operation Genesis management views, where we could see what specific guests were thinking, there's no real feedback to us from those guests. It's another example of a super shallow, poorly implemented feature. Failure. Next, I want to discuss the time controls that Jurassic World Evolution 2 added. In an attempt, it seems, to reduce the downtime. That was one of Jurassic World Evolution 1's biggest problems. Much of that game was spent waiting for things to complete so you could progress. Unfortunately, while the time controls do help in some respects, it seems that the devs have balanced out the presence of time controls by making some tasks, especially the growing of dinosaurs, take longer than they used to. So in some cases, the ability to speed up time ends up cancelled out by the longer time they attach to certain tasks. A very baffling choice, but generally the time controls are a help for park building and campaign building. So I'm going to say that this is a half good, half bad feature. Next, we have the territory system. Again, the idea in theory was simple: allow groups of animals to create their own territory which satisfies their needs. If species territories overlap and they don't like each other, you risk interspecies conflict. However, this system only really applies if you basically use a whole map as an enclosure. For most normal sized enclosures, animal territories will just apply to the entire thing as the animals roam around. And even if you use feeders to try to keep animals in place, many will simply roam around wildly. Oh, and talking about the interspecies conflict, the repetitive Jurassic World Evolution 1 style combat really doesn't make it that much better. Like the guest system, a pointless addition that does very little. Failure. Weather effects are the next thing I wanted to talk about, specific and separate to the biomes. Because while the biomes are a good idea, the unique weather that each biome has is less successful. Sandstorms, tornadoes, blizzards, and stormy weather are the main forms of extreme weather that you will encounter in the game, but they might as well all be the same because they all do the exact same thing. They can damage buildings a bit, agitate the dinosaurs a bit, and that's all. There's no uniqueness in any way to any of the events. Worse still, these extreme events still cannot harm guests or harm dinosaurs in significant ways, which again does not help make the parks feel living or immersive. In addition, the way that these weather events are specific to set biomes means that the maps feel very un-Earth-like. What I mean by that is that even in the UK, we can get blizzards. We see small wind vortices and storms. Deserts can get sudden blizzards or sand twisters. It's a shame that the maps don't have a more variable set of weathers. Or, here's an idea, seasons? A bit like what JPOG had? Oh, and we still have no lightning thunderstorms. Shame. The weather system is a failure.
What's the live count?
22,216.
Any incidents?
Yeah, 6 kids in the lost and found, 28 down with heat stroke.
So, in conclusion, what can we say about all the major new additions that were introduced to Jurassic World Evolution 2? Well, for me, I think there's a general theme about these systems. The story of a good idea, terrible implementation. So many of these systems show promise, and I can see how for a lot of them what they were meant to do and what the idea was in the brains of the Frontier staff that came up with them. However, it is how they included these features in gameplay where they came undone, with some systems like the Scientist system being a total failure due to choices that they made, and others like the Lagoons just not quite hitting the full marks. That is not to say that I think they should rope back on these features in the next game, I just think they needed to think a lot more on how these features work within general gameplay, what their purpose is, and how they'll be used in future DLCs. But if I were to give a general rating for all the game's new elements, I would say mostly they failed. So here is where I finally will speak about DLC content, which there is a lot to discuss. This is also where I will discuss the additional campaign elements. And to make things easier, we will be going through these in release order, because there's a question I want to answer here. Do the DLCs bloat Jurassic World Evolution 2 to the point where it feels overstuffed, or do they actually add worth to the base game?
Park managers, recent developments have allowed you the option of welcoming exciting new additions to your parks.
This was the first DLC we got, which released December 2021, just a month after the game's initial release. It included the Kronosaurus, the Sungoraptorus, and 2 new terrestrial dinosaurs, in the form of Minmi and the Wuerhosaurus. Obviously, the biggest part of this animal pack is the Kronosaurus, which added a new animal that could use the shark feeders in the lagoon, which at the time of its release was a big positive. In addition, the Wuerhosaurus added a large-ish stegosaur to the game, which had nice decoration in its skins. Minmi was generally hailed as cute, although I think some of its skins could have been better, and the Sungoraptorus added a very unusual looking pterosaur. I thought this pack was good at the time, and I think it remains a fairly strong one. Everything it added brought something to the roster.
Park managers, prepare to be amazed by our new selection of dinosaurs, which come from our Camp Cretaceous site.
So it's well known that my opinion of the Camp Cretaceous show is fairly limited, but that has nothing to do with why I think this DLC was a pure cash grab. Released in March 2022, it added only 2 animals. The Monolophosaurus, a small theropod. It is a beautiful animal to give it its credit and has some amazing skins, and the Scorpius Rex, which is hideously ugly but again has decent skins. However, the rest of this DLC was taken up by, at the time, additional skins which have now become variant models. This includes the Oranosaurus and Kentrosaurus. I'm not a massive fan of the Orano here, but the new oversized Kentro is alright. It also added a number of skins for the Ankylosaurus, Carnotaurus, T-Rex, and Baryonyx. By far the biggest addition with this pack was probably the introduction introduction of the lux patterns first seen on the Parasaurolophus, which allowed this animal to glow in the dark with vibrant pink and blue hues. This lux idea would be repeated on several more animals moving on. But beyond that, this DLC feels a little lacking in content. For something labelled as Camp Cretaceous, there's very little else based on the show actually used here. Of course, it's meant to directly cash in on fans of the show, but for the rest of us, this pack really didn't offer much.
Do you remember the first time you saw a dinosaur?
So this was the first big DLC for the game that we got, around the same time that the film released in June 2022. Now, as much as I hate the film, I'll be looking at this pack in detail as a game edition, so there's no bias against it here. Let's start with the campaign. The DLC adds a 2-part campaign which functions as a separate entity to the base game campaign. The campaign plays out fairly similar to the base, where we construct a facility to create, house and look after the animals which we create through the gathering of amber located in the underground amber mines. The first part of the campaign focuses on creating the facilities and the animal. Part 2 of the campaign sees handling the aftermath of Dominion's fires, ensuring the location is returned to a somewhat natural habitat for the dinosaurs to live in. The campaign takes advantage of the original voice talents, bringing in Claire Dearing, Alan Grant, Ellie Sattler, Lewis Dodgson, and Ramsey Cole into the campaign, meaning that unlike the Chaos Theory modes, this campaign feels more related to the movies it pertains to be linked to. However, it cannot be ignored that the campaign itself is a relatively shallow experience, mostly due to the gameplay issues inherent with the basic game. While the Biosyn building set has a few unique oddities, more on this in a minute, very little directly changes. The same scientist system remains a pain to use, the same ranger gameplay remains tedious, and again it's not a very long campaign, so it doesn't add a huge amount of campaign content. In addition to the campaign, the DLC also added the Chaos Theory map Sierra Nevada, a pure snow map with gameplay based around tower defense and animal rustling. Moving on from this, let's look at what the DLC brings in terms of animals. As you'd expect, it introduces the key species from Biosyn Valley into the game, either through new animal additions or through variant skins. Therizinosaurus comes with wonderful skins and a model design based solely on the film. Its addition brought a very unique dinosaur to the game, as well as some very cool animations. On top of that, it's one of the few animals with amazing skins all across the board. Then we have the Dimetrodon, the first non-Mesozoic era animal that came to the game. While its model suffers from being based on the movie, so it looks rather inaccurate, it made up for it with an okay social animation and some nice skins. We also got the Pyroraptor, which brought the first more accurate raptor depiction to the game. Of course, the model suffers due to its film depiction looking very ugly, but it had amazing skins. And of course, the biggest addition from this DLC being that enormous Quetzalcoatlus that, while it struggles to fit in our aviaries, is pretty impressive, and again, came with great skins. For other species, we got new skin variants, which later would become full variants. This includes the new Kaiju-esque Giganotosaurus and the new Dreadnoughtus design. These two variants definitely saved these species, improving their overall look from the ugly designs Frontier had come up with. We also got 2 new skins for the T-Rex, a new skin for the Dilophosaurus, and 3 new skins for the Parasaurolophus. I personally really like the new Parasaurolophus skins, as I find them a lot nicer than the base game design. This DLC also brought with it the new building set, the Biosyn set. This is a very unique set of structures with a few interesting traits. Firstly, the overall design of the buildings is very different to the other sets, and I especially like how some of the buildings come with these grassy, mossy roofs. One unique aspect to several of these structures is the connection to the underground Hyperloop, an alternative transport system which allows you to connect regions of your parks together, as well as connect to deployable viewing towers. The only attraction this DLC added. While much of the building set is inherently aimed at facility builders, I appreciate the effort to make some new aspects of gameplay to the buildings. One significant important addition, at least for non-modders, was the addition of the new invisible fences, or mostly invisible. There's still the glowing metal bars that appear very clearly in the dark, however it still provides, for non-modders, a less obvious in-your-face fence type that you can use in park building. We also have a smattering of new decoration pieces which work nicely around our parks, most of them based on the plaza structures we see in the movie, incorporating these large brutalist metal art structures, many coming with lighting. Also included is that circular fountain and some additions to the amenities that include these decorative pieces. One area of disappointment are the Biosyn Valley trees, which are basically just alpine trees with some hanging vines on them. I find them being called a unique set of trees in the update info a bit of an insult. Something that the Chaos Theory mode added were a group of buildings that are used in that game mode as your defensive structures, however they also function as decorative structures in Sandbox. This includes the Watchtower, which I actually really like to use in my facility style builds, these security cameras, which again I like to use as pretend park security, these flashbang mortars and heat detectors, which I don't really have a purpose for, and what is for me the most important decorative element, the tall floodlight tower. This large and powerful lighting rig can really help illuminate your park during the darkness. Next to discuss as part of this DLC is the two maps that it included. The Sierra Nevada map is the only pure snow map that we have. While that makes it perfect for making snow-only parks, it also ruins the texture paints for ground textures, so I've never built a park on this map. The other map, the Biosyn Valley map, comes with its own unique ground textures and comes with this very atmospheric mist effect. It does give the map a unique feel, and it's reasonably large and flat, which makes it good for park building. So overall, what are my thoughts? Well, at the time, I questioned the reason as to why all of the film content was being sold back to us, given the limited base game campaign. And given that Jurassic World Evolution 1 gave us the Fallen Kingdom species for free when that movie released, I felt then, and feel now, that this DLC was part 1 of reselling cut content from the game's release. However, I do think a lot of what the DLC added to the game was good, but again, little was done to introduce very cool new features. For example, while the Hyperloop edition was nice, it's rather limited to only a few buildings. There's no broader use of, say, a Hyperloop station, for example, that we could have used around the parks. And again, it's worth pointing out that this was our second facility set, and an incomplete set at that. So overall good, but I think the fact that everything was paid content was a little bit of a cash grab.
Attention park managers. We have exciting new late Cretaceous species for your park.
This pack was another animal pack that brought 4 animals to the game. 2 that I think were very important. The Alamosaurus brought to the game an actually great looking sauropod with great skins, patterns, and a super cute social animation, and the Styxosaurus, a long-necked plesiosaur with frills that also came with these amazing Lux patterns. These 2 creatures for me brought something very unique to the game's roster. It also included the Australovenator, an alright medium carnivore with nice skins, and the Barbaridactylus, a nice crested pterosaur that basically replaced the Pteranodon. All in all, I think these were good additions to the roster.
Every desert has an oasis. Malta's no different. You can build something special here from nothing.
Ah, part 2 of selling us back the Dominion content that was cut from the game. This DLC, however, is what I think was always meant to be the game's actual campaign, and I have a few reasons for thinking this. Let's start with the basics. The campaign for this DLC takes the form of another separate campaign set from the base game, taking us to Malta. We work across 3 different islands, creating some facility-inspired parks and some tourist-focused parks. While we play across these islands, we work alongside returning characters and their voice talent, consisting of Kayla, Sonia, Santos, Barry, and Lewis Dodgson. This campaign also sees us interact with some of the new elements this DLC introduced, and some very unique map aspects. So let's start with explaining why I think this was the original game's intended campaign. Firstly, this is by far the longest campaign of the game, with 3 islands to construct on. If you go all out to 5-starring each of them, you easily have a good 4 to 6 hours of additional campaign here. so it almost feels like a slightly less grindy form of the original game's campaign, cut down to a more acceptable length. However, much like all other aspects of the game, there's no real narrative here. There is a clear attempt to generate one through the back and forth between characters, but that's about all. Much like the base game campaigns and Chaos Theory modes, the attempt to build narrative here is incredibly shallow, with no narrative construction, and as such I still feel that this is failing Rich Newbold's point about creating an original narrative. The next reason why I believe this was the game's intended campaign was that we have a multi-island style campaign, very different to the linear tutorial from the base game. We have 3 different islands, one with a very distinct environmental feature, which I'll discuss in a moment, and we are allowed to jump from one island to another with ease. We also have the addition of a cargo ship which we can use to store animals and transport them from one island to another if we wish, which solves one of the key problems with Jurassic World Evolution 1's campaign, where spare animals had to be sold off rather than used in other parks on other islands. This makes it feel again like a better version of the first game's campaign with some added quality of life features, and it's a very different style to that of the base game or the Biosyn DLC. Finally, progression on each island is relatively similar, with a handful of missions you must do for our named characters, including those from the tutorial campaign, which is then supported by regular contracts and standard star-based progression. It feels very much like the sort of thing you'd expect from the campaign. So in my eyes, the Malta DLC was the base game's campaign cut out and sold back to us. Obviously I have some thoughts about that, but I'll save it for the conclusion. So what does the Malta DLC introduce and makes it unique? Well, a few features actually. The first of these is the new dinosaur exchange system, which plays on the very underused plot from the movie, that of the authorities versus the black market. The premise is that you can acquire dinosaurs' eggs and genomes, as well as sell dinosaurs to various groups. Some of these will be genuine, and some of them will be from the black market. By working with either group, you build reputation with these groups, allowing access to more impressive animals and so on. It's essentially similar to the original game's division system, just with a bit more of a binary choice attached to it. Now on the whole, this system sounds like a good feature, introducing a lot of risk-reward strategy to the game, given that you can never be completely sure what the black market will be giving you, and introducing a semi-moral choice system. Do you work with the authorities and play it safe, or do you work with the shady underground? Also, this system also works in Sandbox, which offers some unique sandbox play opportunities. Unfortunately, Frontier rather cut the legs off the system, which could have genuinely been interesting and could have, like many other elements of the game, driven narrative. And they wreck it in the same way they wrecked the original game's division system. During the Malta campaign, you're forced to work for both the authorities and the black market. There's no player agency here, no player choice allowed. You can't roleplay either side of the story, nor experience differences in campaign play. You have to play both sides. So we have this very preposterous situation where we work with the good guys, while also deliberately working with Santos, who we know is in the game of illegal activities. It's kind of stupid, just like the film this DLC is based on, frankly, and as I said, removes the possible interesting narrative possibilities that a moral choice system like this provides. Such a missed opportunity. The next unique feature of this DLC was the large natural lagoon present on the second island. A unique feature that was only ever present on this map. This large natural lagoon is easily big enough to represent a great location for our marine animals. However, again, Frontier demonstrates that while it has good ideas, it rather mucks up on the implementation. The natural lagoon is a complete waste of space. While in theory you can plonk your aquatic animals in here, good luck making it anything more than just water. Firstly, and as I mentioned with the lagoon decorations, decorating this natural lagoon is completely impossible. It's way too large and the decorations are way too small. Then we have the viewing galleries and hatchery. that are pre-placed and cannot be moved or deleted. All of them are attached to specific locations indicated by the piers. What's more is that the empty piers can only be used for the external decoration pieces, which look totally weird and kind of sad stuck on them. The natural lagoon inside also looks equally poor, with just plain seabed sand and nothing interesting pre-placed. It's such a waste of a feature that could really have been something unique for this DLC. The maps for this DLC are added as sandbox maps, and Sandbox exposes a further issue with the natural lagoon, being that even if you pick a particular area for sandbox building, the structures around the lagoon are still the pre-placed Malta ones. Why was this done? Why can't we change what they look like? It's just another example of lazy implementation. On to the animals now. This DLC brought us 4 new species. The Atrociraptor is probably the biggest species that this added. While not that distinctly different to the Velociraptors, I will say that it has some very nice skins. Also added was the feathered Oviraptor, a very well-known dinosaur which was nice to see come to the game, and again, like many of the feathered animals, comes with great skins. Moros comes to this DLC, which I find odd considering in the movie that it's at Biosyn, but it comes with nice enough looking skins. And finishing up the roster is the Lystrosaurus, an early Triassic period animal that is another representative of non-dinosaur life. Now there is an issue with this roster. 3 of the 4 animals are of the tiny category, and as I mentioned earlier in the previous chapter, these come with the problem that they're not really designed to suit the overall scale that the game has been built for, so they often just disappear into the grass. The Oviraptor might look great, but all too often it'll disappear from view. We also got 3 new variants. Dimorphodon got a new, smaller feathered skin to match its representative in the film. We also got the version of the Iguanodon featured in the cut prologue footage. Both of these, in my view, are not really that great. The Dimorphodon skin does little to make the animal more interesting, and the Iguanodon remodel in-game just looks off. It has a very ugly texture, and the model stretches a lot when it's moving around. It also looks really top or front heavy. The Allosaurus has its film model, but it's one of my least liked remodels in the game. It makes the Allosaurus look scraggly and kind of mutated. Not my favourite. My favourite of the new skins is the Carnotaurus skin, adding this demon-esque skin, which I really like. The DLC also introduced the Malta building set, with a range of buildings featuring wonderful stonework. There are elements of this building set that I enjoy. The sandstone buildings are very different to our other building sets, and the hotel is a building especially I really like. However, the major issue with this building set is that they are trying to twist what is primarily a facility set into a tourist-focused one. We have this wonderful hotel at the back, but at the front, this old, decrepit-looking frontage. Other buildings, like the viewing buildings, have the same problems. The presence of this rusty red metal coloration on buildings also doesn't help with the theme. I would argue that this building set is primarily a facility set. Another facility set, and unlike the Biosyn set, brings nothing as unique as the Hyperloop system. Another reason why I think this was the base game campaign all along. There's no features here that really rock the boat in terms of park building. We also have a range of decorative pieces, including perhaps the most important elements to park building, sandstone wall pieces and this sandstone tower. I've used these all over my parks, and they are worth getting the DLC for. Other pieces are just a smattering of abandoned structures and mostly old rusty equipment. Unfortunately, the building set has a major drawback. Beyond it being just a facility set, I mean. Unlike the Biosyn DLC, which at least added Biosyn decorations to the amenities, the Malta building set makes no attempt to alter the appearance of the amenities at all. Which means we have all these wonderful sandstone buildings, and then we have these ugly old concrete amenities next to them. Was it too much work for them to create a sandstone texture for the amenities? Was it too much to add some of the wall elements onto the amenities as decorations? Was it too much to add some Malta style lights and decorations that we could use? There are so many buildings from the Malta building set I like, such as this wonderful Napoleonic era bunker with cannon that serves as the emergency bunker or the hotel, but it's very difficult to use them in our parks that are not facilities. We also have a new biome set with this DLC, bringing in some actually new trees, unlike the Biosyn one, which I find myself using a lot in Sandbox, as they're pretty useful trees to include, especially the large olive trees. The biome's alright, it's more or less a colour swap of a desert, but it's enough of a difference to make it worth it, and instead of sandstorms, we get normal storms. So no new unique weather either. Overall, I think this DLC feels completely like cut content being sold to us, especially given that the new animals introduced to the roster feel kind of lackluster for a paid for DLC, and given that the campaign feels like a genuine campaign as opposed to the base game tutorial. Do I think it's a worthwhile DLC? It's hard to say. Much of its worth in terms of animals is probably based on whether you liked Dominion's Malta section or not. The campaign feels like decent content. It does offer a lot of material for sandbox building, but it can't be denied that the few unique elements this DLC did bring were implemented poorly. So I'm very much on the fence about this one.
Attention, park managers. Prepare to welcome some new feathered species into your park.
So our first DLC of 2023, and what set a very unfortunate precedent for this year of DLC. This pack introduced 4 new species to the game, all of them with feathers. We got the Dinosaurs, a feathered large animal with a cute social animation and great skins. We got the Tyrannus, a feathered tyrannosaur with again great decorative skins. The Sinosauropteryx, a small little predator that looked very cute, even if its skins weren't the best. But it's the final animal of this pack, which I think serves as a great metaphor for Jurassic World Evolution 2 as a whole, or at least provides another example of great idea, bad implementation. The final animal of this pack was the feathered pterosaur Yeholopterus, a super small, adorable creature with fantastic skins, well deserving of the player base's nickname of the butterfly pterosaur. However, it is this animal's diet that brought something interesting. You see, a creature this small would look stupid eating fish, so Frontier created an insect feeder for this animal to eat from. Great idea. But they failed to take the opportunity to allow other animals to eat from it too. There's a number of animals that could have made use of this. Dimorphodon, Sungaripterus, Struthiomimus, Archaeornithomimus, Morosintrepidas, the Compies, Sinosauropteryx, Coelophysis, Oviraptor. These animals all could have made use of this feeder and had an omnivorous diet, but they don't. So we have this new feeder, but it only applies to one animal. What a complete waste of possibilities for adding more omnivorous diets to the animals. That being said, these animals look so good that this pack was a very big boost to the roster.
Park managers, journey with us into the lagoons and discover these impressive marine species.
This for me remains the best DLC of them all, and is for me one of the most important in terms of animal packs. This DLC added 4 new marine animals, and 4 very different marine animals, which help to give our lagoons a bit of a new feel. We have the Nothosaurus, a Triassic period animal that comes with an adorable social animation and some great skins and luck skins on top of it. We have the Archelon, a giant Cretaceous period turtle with again some great skins. We have Shonisaurus, a supersized member of the Ichthyosaur family that has some amazing skins and adds a very whale-like animal to our lagoons. And one of my favourite animals of all time, the armoured predatory Devonian fish Dunkleosteus, another shark-eating animal with a very suitable social. Why I consider this DLC important, if not vital for the game, is that it introduced 4 very different animals, all with very different feels and attitudes to the game's lagoons. It added 3 animals that I consider add a more family-friendly range to the lagoons. It added 2 animals that have very unique shapes, both of which use the new rock islands to rest on, adding a small amount of additional decoration to the lagoons. It added a huge whale that we could use if we wanted a supersized animal and didn't want a mosasaur. And it added the dunk. What more could you ask for? I still consider it the best DLC animal pack.
Alerting all park managers. prepare to introduce some new powerful predators to your park.
November 2023, and we suddenly felt a little nervous. A third animal pack in a row. It had been assumed that the next DLC would be an expansion, considering previous experience with the first game and the first year or so of this game's release. Instead, 4 more animals. That being said, these animals were good. We got the Tarbosaurus, a chunky T-Rex sporting its Camp Cretaceous model, the beautiful Utahraptor, a fully feathered model and simply amazing skins, the much requested humpback Concavinator, and the fully feathered peculiar Gigantoraptor, a supersized Oviraptorid. 2 more feathered animals to add to our collection, a long requested other animal, and something for the fans of the streaming show to get excited about. All over, this pack was a decent enough addition, bringing us a new large theropod to the roster and new feathered animals. That being said, this DLC was, I think, a little overshadowed, at least for me, by the free update that made a number of movie models full variants, fundamentally saving the Brachiosaurus, Stegosaurus and Pteranodon. On the whole, while these animals did bring much requested new animals, I do think there is a bit of bloat here, especially given the range of other similar sized animals that we already had. And while the Utah is beautiful, it can't be ignored it was yet another raptor to add to the list. I think whether this pack is important for the game or not comes down to your very personal preference of the animals.
Genetic modification is the most powerful tool ever created. Like any tool, it requires skill to wield.
Perhaps the most controversial pack, this DLC that came in early 2024, re-adding the missing hybrids from the first game, with 1 extra. All animals came with Lux skins, and the pack also added a Lux skin to the Indoraptor and Indorex. The Stegoceratops returned, with minor model changes. Spinoraptor 2 returned, with minor changes beyond its Lux skin. It was perhaps the Ankylodocus that was the most famous from this pack, going through a complete remodel from its first game version, now looking far better, with great skins and a Lux pattern. Our only new animal was the Spinoceratops, a frilled Sinoceratops variant that again came from Camp Cretaceous. It was rather unique for being a ceratopsian that enjoyed eating fish. The additional glow-in-the-dark skins for the Indorex and Indoraptor were nice to have, but I do have some criticisms with this DLC. I find it very annoying the Indoraptor and Indorex Lux skins were added as skin designs, not patterns, like the Lux patterns for other animals, because it means you're restricted to the body colours on that skin, and for the 2 animals they were pretty dull. One positive about the DLC was that the hybrid animals all got unique social animations with their hybrid donors, which adds some unique interspecies social animation to a few animals. However, we now have to look at what are, for me, 2 very large criticisms. First, I think an opportunity was missed here to introduce a Lagoon hybrid and an Aviary hybrid, which would have allowed this pack to make use of new features which this game added. I think that would have taken the edge off what is the biggest issue with this pack. Here is the difficult question. Is this a cash grab? It could be argued that this is perhaps the most blatant example of reselling us content. All of Jurassic World Evolution 1's animals were given to us, even the DLC ones, but not these. So in some respects it could be argued that the pack was making us pay yet again for the same content. Others have argued that the redesigns of the Ankylodocus, the new Spinoceratops, and the new skins and animations do make up for it. I also think that people's views on this pack are very much driven by personal bias, perhaps more than any other pack. Obviously, if you are generally a fan of the hybrids as a concept, you probably consider this pack with a much more favourable view than those of us who consider the whole hybrid concept a little stupid. Curious to know people's views, I asked Reddit for their opinions, and some interesting things revealed themselves. Many of those who spoke positively about the pack were either those who were pro-hybrid as a general rule, or more interestingly, those who did not buy the first game or the DLC for the first game. Those who spoke negatively, meanwhile, focused on the reselling of the content, the limited changes made to the animals, and general anti-hybrid sentiment. It's clear that the pack remains controversial, and a charged topic as much as hybrids also remain so. But this is my review, so I have to make a judgment here. And fundamentally, that means I need to decide if they did enough to make the repeat sale of this pack to us more than a cash grab. In my view, they did not. Given that this animal pack was yet another animal pack after the others from the previous year, I feel that more effort should have been done on this pack. Yes, some elements like the Ankylodocus remodel were vital for the pack to be at least half passable, but to me, too much of this pack was reselling us content that really should have been there on the game's launch. Given these animals remained the only ones cut from Jurassic World Evolution 1's roster, it's a choice that now seems like a total cash grab.
Discover the greatest and smallest creatures to roam our prehistoric planet.
May 2024 saw our final DLC yet, another animal pack. This pack brought 4 highly requested animals to the game. The main animal for this pack, and the one that everyone brought it for, was the Megalodon. Probably now the most overrated and well-known animal. Frontier did at least make it look good with its skins. We also got a proper Asdarchid pterosaur in the form of Thanatos Dracon, a beautiful animal. Such a shame that we never got to see these pterosaurs walking around. The final 2 animals were the long-awaited Microceratus, missing from the Dominion DLCs, beautiful if not tiny, and the Segisaurus, another small carnivore that's considered canon to Jurassic Park because it was presented on a single prop made for the film. This pack introduced a few questions for me. Firstly, why was the Microceratus here and not within the larger expansion DLCs? I also wondered how they could argue that this pack included highly requested species. I had rarely seen Segisaurus on anyone's lists, nor had I ever seen Thanatos Dracon. Megalodon is the only one I would say people were really desperate for, and again, we have 2 small animals that suffer from the scaling issue. That being said, the Meg and the Thanatos Dracon are so good to have in the roster that they easily make up for the small criticisms I have about this pack. They did, together, bring something new to the roster.
Bigger. Scarier? Cooler, I believe is the word that you used in your memo.
So, in conclusion, we have more DLC than the first game, but not necessarily better DLC. The second game's DLC was primarily focused around dinosaur packs, with only 2 expansion DLCs to the first game's 3. This is a very important aspect to consider, considering how the DLC affects the overall view of the game. It can't be ignored that the 2 DLCs we got were basically Here's the Dominion movie, compared with the first game, where all the expansion DLCs felt more original, or at least had some original ideas behind them than just here's the movie stuff. And both expansion DLCs struggle to break away from the idea of here's the Dominion movie stuff that was always meant to be here, but COVID spoiled things. Then we come to the animal packs themselves. While many of the animals did bring some good things to the roster, whether it was new interesting animals or great skins, there's a trait to them. Out of curiosity, I looked at the time periods that these animals came from. A whopping 24 animals are from the Cretaceous period, with only 3 coming from the Jurassic and 2 from the Triassic. If we total up all of the animals included in all DLCs, that means that 63%, basically 2/3 of the animals, are from the Cretaceous period. Yes, there's a smattering of other time zones included. I just think it's an interesting trait that we have so many animals from that period in the DLCs. I feel opportunities to more fairly represent other time periods were missed. I also find it strange that we got dedicated time period packs multiple times for the Cretaceous period, but didn't get anything like that for other time periods. I find it equally curious we got a marine animal focused pack and a carnivore focused pack, and a hybrid focused pack, but no pterosaur focused pack, and no herbivore focused pack. In some respects, I find elements of the DLC for this game not as good as a whole entity as the first game's DLC. This game's DLC felt too heavily reliant on animal packs as opposed to more useful expansions, and there were missed chances to introduce DLCs that would make Jurassic World Evolution 2 stand out more. However, many of the added animals come with some great animations or great skins, which is a factor that really shouldn't be ignored. If I was to come to a final opinion, I think the lack of a third expansion really harmed JWE2, and in that regard only, the DLC handling of the second game was worse than the first. But overall, I wouldn't say that the DLC bloats the game. So here we are, hours of talking down, the game pulled apart and examined like a fossil in Dr. Wu's lab. I've attempted as much as possible to be fair as I've gone through this. However, before I can come to a general conclusion about the game, there is one last thing that has to be addressed.
That first park was legit. You know, I have a lot of respect for it. They didn't need these genetic hybrids. They just needed dinosaurs, real dinosaurs. That's kind of enough.
Please don't wear it again.
While I have been conducting this retrospective review, I have very much focused on Frontier as the developers, but that's not really the true story, is it? There is an ugly truth to Jurassic World Evolution 2, an elephant in the room that we have to discuss, and that's called Universal. The fact is, Jurassic World Evolution 2 is not a Frontier game. It's a game made by Frontier on behalf of Universal, for a brand that they own. And that brings in a huge asterisk to a lot of what I've said in this review, because the brand plays its own part in all this. After all, we're not playing a planet dinosaur, are we? We're buying a product made with a clear, distinct purpose, and that purpose is to make Universal more money off its brand. That is the primary purpose. It is also why people buy it, because of the brand. And this comes with a lot of additional factors when we are discussing Jurassic World Evolution 2 and how it turned out. It can be assumed that Frontier has to run all of its intentions of any of the Evolution games by Universal. That's the standard way it works with a licensed product. After all, Universal don't want Frontier to do anything that might damage the brand. We heard about this with the first game, when it was made clear that Universal wanted one character not to be altered in any way. We can assume that Jurassic World Evolution 2 and its many elements had to be okayed by them. We don't know how much of an influence they had on the final product we got, and we probably never will. And we have to remember that Universal know nothing about game design or making a good management game, and as such, it's possible that many of the strange mechanical issues presented in the game are caused by that. The next factor we have to remember here is that there would be financial elements to Universal's license. We don't know whether they take a cut from all Jurassic World Evolution 2 sales, or if Frontier paid a lump sum for the license. We also don't know if Universal were the people deciding on what price all the elements, the game, the DLC, etc. would have. We also have to remember that Universal is not a games company. And a final factor to remember is that the brand itself, Jurassic, has gone through changes with the newest trilogy of films. As Best in Slot said about Dominion, the franchise isn't aimed at him anymore. I think it's a fair assessment. The Jurassic World trilogy has a very different feel to the Jurassic Park trilogy. There's a much greater reliance on Godzilla-style monster movie cliches like excessive dinosaur-on-dinosaur violence and destruction. The hybrids are a good demonstrator of that. Modern Jurassic movies are much more action-packed and have mostly forgotten the serious, atmospheric thriller aspects that arguably were strongest in the first film and present in the next two. And as such, we can assume that those changes in the brand also affected the game. And maybe the cause of many of the mechanical limitations and why it feels the game has been directed at a general dinosaur audience and not fans of management games. It also probably is the cause of why much of the game is very simplistic. as Universal has retooled much of the Jurassic franchise to become aimed at children, and as such this translated to the game. I think this is something we have to remember as we conclude the retrospective review.
And with the sequel we wanted to kind of build on the foundations of that, so we focused the sequel on 4 key areas.
So before I give my view of the game, I want to return to Rich Newbolds' checklist that he presented in the pre-release dev blogs, which I spoke about all the way back in chapter 1. To remind you, Rich said that they wanted to improve and develop the game in 4 distinct areas. Number 1, an authentic narrative. Number 2, enhanced creativity. Number 3, deeper management. And number 4, more realistic dinosaurs. So what I want to do is go back to these and use them to judge Jurassic World Evolution 2 by Frontier's own standards. Let's go through these one by one. First of all, the authentic narrative and original story factor. This is a total failure in my eyes. I can certainly see where they've attempted to do something with the storytelling and narrative elements, but generally it's an incredibly shallow attempt. No aspect, the campaigns, chaos theories or challenge modes, do anything to create a solid narrative, with very little evidence of narrative structure or elements. And what's worse is that they had the perfect opportunity to tell a narrative-focused story with the game's linear campaigns or with the chaos theories. All we got was basic dialogue, and that, Mr. Newbold, is not narrative. Next up is customization. Here, Jurassic World Evolution 2 earns a total success. While there's limitations, especially when we consider the Aviaries and Lagoons, the fact is, Jurassic World Evolution 2 has vastly improved the ways in which we can customize our parks. The larger quantity of decorative pieces, brand new building sets, expansive variation on vegetation, and the new biomes all help with that. But by far the element that I think is most impressive was the amenity customization system, which not only gave us a very unique type of customization for our parks, but represents a system that could easily be expanded on in the next game. I'm not being sarcastic when I say this system represents something truly great about Jurassic World Evolution 2. The third element that Rich spoke about was that Jurassic World Evolution 2 should have a good focus on management, especially when it comes to park management. It is clear that here attempts were made to provide more management when compared to the first game. We can see this in the scientist systems, guest types, and other various elements. The problem is that what is also clear, having gone back and considered these elements, is that most of them failed due to some poor choices and poor implementation, or in the case of the guest types, just completely shallow elements that don't really have much impact. Moreover, there are still some aspects of park management totally missing. We don't have proper economic management in the game, and in fact we have less economic management than we did in the first game. So I think I have to consider this an attempt, but ultimately a failure. Finally, on Rich Newbold's list was that the animals should be much more realistic, with dynamic behavior. Again, much like management, it's clear that attempts have been made. A wider range of animations, especially social and idle animations, represents a clear attempt to make the animals more real. However, again, there are mechanical limits to this. Pterosaurs have a significant lack of animation and elements to make them feel realistic. Aquatic animals have more, and terrestrial animals have the most, but there's a lot of repetition in the animations. On top of that is almost a complete lack of animations that show interaction between the animal and the environment where they live. Hunting animations are limited too, with some animals totally unable to defend themselves in any way. And even if the animals have some animations, the fact that they still wait about for animation loops to play damages the dynamic claims about them. Attempts were made, but much like with the management, they were a long way off from successful. But to be kind to Rich, I'm gonna give them a half pass for this. So by Frontier's own standards, what do we have? 2 failures, a success, and a half success. If I were grading this as a teacher, I would probably have written on top of the paper, "See me after class." Frontier's desires for the game and where it was going to improve demonstrates that while attempts were made with all 4 aspects, most either failed or just didn't go far enough. So, with the game judged by Frontier's checklist, now it's time to get to the final section of this review. My final judgment.
Says that they insist on outside opinions.
What kind of opinions?
Well, your kind, not to put too fine a point on it.
So before I go into my judgment, there's a few side points I would like to make first. The first of these is that while I can sit here and criticize and nitpick and judge, the fact is I'm not a game developer. I haven't had to work on this game, and I think often when it comes to criticizing media, we often forget that there are many hard-working people behind these products. The game industry as a whole is not an industry of companies and high-ranking, high-paid executives, but an industry of thousands of hard-working people who often have to operate under very difficult conditions, working extremely long hours. The game industry is beset with all sorts of problems these days. Crunch working hours, poor pay, and more criminal issues are all common news stories around the games industry. Frontier themselves have made numerous people redundant in recent years. These people are the ones often doing the hardest work, and whatever our views on the final product, it's important to remember the lives often attached to these projects. So I want to take the opportunity to say thank you to those who did work on this game. The next thing I want to mention is something that I mentioned in Chapter 1. The fact is, if that we assume a 2-year development period for JWE 2, then a good chunk of its development, it also had to tackle the difficulties of COVID and the UK COVID lockdowns. It is worth just quickly detailing this. Let's assume that the game started development in November 2019, which would give them a 2-year time period. 4 months after that, the whole of the UK went into total lockdown, with the Prime Minister of the time, Boris Johnson, ordering everyone to stay at home unless they were key workers. While this lockdown was eased in the following months, many were still working from home and local lockdowns were still in place. In September 2020, there was a second countrywide lockdown, which lasted throughout the rest of the year. A third national lockdown was imposed January 2021. All these lockdowns, the enforced working from home and more, would have impacted the game's development. We know it delayed the release of Dominion. While I would not go as far as to say that COVID is the reason this game may not have been as good as we wanted, I think it's fair to say that COVID did have some sort of impact. As a last small point, I want to mention something that has occurred to me as a result of meeting a fellow Jurassic World Evolution 2 player in the last few days. This player, who has suffered a life-altering injury, spoke to me about his love of the game and how much they enjoy playing it. YouTube itself is full of content of people criticizing content, whether it's films or games or shows. And while I'm sure much of that content is good meaning, I think sometimes it's easy to forget that for a lot of people, they can look past the elements that we're critical of and just enjoy things for what they are. While I am not one who will ever take someone saying, it's just a game, as a reason to ignore where criticisms can be made, I respect those people who do enjoy the game for what it is. And in some ways, I almost wish I was more able to ignore the flaws and set my critical mindset to the side. I hope that throughout this retrospective review, I've at least been fair, used evidence to support my opinions, and I want to make it clear that in no way is anything I've said meant to discourage or disparage those who do have fun. More the power to you. Now, with all that said, my final thoughts. When I wrote my Jurassic World Evolution 1 review, I already knew what the end was going to be. My thoughts of the game were never going to change. But with Jurassic World Evolution 2, I find myself more torn. My view of the game was not concrete at the start, and having gone through this whole process, it remains in many ways unclear. There are clear improvements that have occurred with this game. Those cannot be ignored, because it represents a clear attempt by Jurassic World Evolution 2's developers to create a better game. It's clear in many areas that they did listen to the criticisms we had about JWE 1. It took those lessons on board, and did try in many ways to make improvements to tackle those issues. An attempt, no matter what the outcome of that attempt, is always better than no attempt at all, and that has to be respected. The problem lays in the trying to fix those criticisms. They equally ended up compounding problems that remained from the first title, and then added further ones on top of it. The management, for example, in this management game still remains simply shocking. The the total absence of economic controls, the excessive dependence on animal pack DLCs, the shoddy implementation of core building features, and the prevalence of technical errors with the game do very little to help. The presence of game breaking and game frustration bugs, many of which were present on day one that still remain unfixed, make the whole game feel rushed and slapped together to cash in on the brand name. Worse still, the performance problems and really awful optimization make playing the game now, years later, less than free of problems. In that regards, the second game is actually worse than the original. But comparing the first game to this is not necessarily the best way of judging it. The first game was a tighter experience, true, and perhaps more functional, but was extremely limited in so many aspects. The second game has loftier goals and ambitions, but often fell short of fully achieving them. As I've tackled this retrospective review, I found myself uncertain how I can come to a final conclusion. Should I judge it as a sequel and apply my favourite video game reviewers' methods? I'm not sure it's fair to do that. Should I judge this as a game on its own? Again, I'm not sure you can do it, given the first game and Frontier's other titles, which we have to consider when we look at this game. Some people have called Jurassic World Evolution 2 just the first game with some minor changes and a graphical overhaul, as if the first game has been put in a new frock. Do I agree with this? No, I fundamentally don't. I might have done before starting the process, but I don't agree with that now. There's just too many ways this game stands out from its predecessor. But is it a worthy sequel? I'm not sure that it is. Some people have called this game a side grade, and as I explored the various elements and replayed all the parts of the game, looking at the updates and improvements, I feel that it could be easily argued it certainly feels like a side grade. Both games, in many ways, end up at the same point on the ladder. Both tackled the game's development in broadly similar ways, with slight differences between them. Both games hyper-focused on aspects that perhaps were not as vital, at least to me, as the ones that should have been given the most time. Fundamentally, the second game has failed to innovate, in the eyes of many, in many of significant ways that I, as a player of park management games, feel it needed to. It feels to me so much like the game Jurassic World Evolution 1 was wanting to be all along. That is not inherently a bad thing, and some of the best games I've ever played could be argued are just minor improvements of the game that came before. But perhaps the true problem is that Jurassic World Evolution 1 was so lacking in so many dimensions, mechanically, narratively, and in gameplay, and that Jurassic World Evolution 2 is so clearly heavily built upon its underpinnings, and reusing so much of that palette, that the second game has ended up with the same problems as its predecessor, just demonstrated in different ways. And of course, there are questions we simply cannot answer. We cannot know how badly COVID affected the game, nor can we conclude how much of the game was affected by Universal's influence. All I can judge is the product we have. A poor sequel, a side grade, a game with lofty goals that missed the mark on so many of them, a game that wanted to be more than it was able to be. I think all these things are true of JWE2. I cannot with good conscience call the game bad, for it really isn't. There are far worse games out there. But perhaps it is fair to say it remains by the end of its development an unremarkable average sequel. And perhaps that's the most damning thing to say about this game. Will it stay with me in my memory like JPOG did? Will its animals be burned into my mind as Walking with Dinosaurs did? I don't think so. Perhaps in years to come, we'll look upon JWE2 as the middle child, the middle film, the Clone Wars of this gaming trilogy. A game that perhaps will be superseded by the one that comes after, the game that followed from a disaster before. The one that becomes just another game on the list, as the games either side of it are the ones we have much stronger feelings on. being so average that it almost becomes part of the background. Will I be reinstalling this in 10 years' time? Much like Jurassic World Evolution 1 remains mostly forgotten by many of us, I fear Jurassic World Evolution 2 will face the same future. The biggest problem with Jurassic World Evolution 2 is the thing at the end of the title, the 2. Perhaps the problem is that this game was not Jurassic World Evolution 1, and this makes me worry for the future. We know a third game is coming. Will it end up as a repeat? Another game that feels too similar to the predecessor, that doesn't innovate enough through fear of alienating a younger player base, or because of Universal's indifference and involvement. And what of Frontier? Planet Coaster 2 launched to a huge amount of criticism and negativity for doing many of the things that they did with Jurassic World Evolution 2, only in a greater amount. It seems that Frontier has moved on beyond its golden age that Elite Dangerous and Planet Coaster helped to create. Are we seeing a company starting to end up like so many others, losing what made them great? What made us like their games? Jurassic World Evolution 3 is coming, but there are no guarantees it will improve. And here I think I can say something that does sum up my thoughts. JWE2 is the game that made me say no to pre-orders. It's the game that made me say no to buying anything on day one. It's the game that has made me say no to shoddy deluxe editions. It's the game that has made me say to Jurassic World Evolution 3 and Frontier that you have to earn my interest and my money this time. And perhaps, after all of this, that's the worst thing that Jurassic World Evolution 2 has done. If you're listening to this, I want to say thank you for making it through this rather long retrospective review. I hope that you found it interesting, or that I made you think of something that perhaps you had not thought about before. Please consider throwing this video a like if so. Feel free to leave your comments, and subscribe should you be new here for more content from the channel. Wherever you are, stay safe, and goodbye.